It began with a village caught in motion, not moving itself, but forced to absorb the momentum of an army that could no longer keep going. La Gleize sat quietly among rolling hills and narrow roads, a place shaped by farms, stone houses, and the slow rhythm of rural life. In winter, it should have been silent except for wind brushing across fields and the distant creak of trees under snow. But in December of 1944, La Gleize became something else entirely. It became a stopping point. And in war, stopping can be more dangerous than advancing. The Ardennes forest pressed close around the village, its roads twisting through valleys that funneled men and machines into tight corridors. Snow lay unevenly across the ground, churned into gray slush by boots and tracks. The cold was constant, sinking into gloves, into bones, into thoughts. Breath fogged the air even when no one spoke, and through that frozen landscape came elements of one of the most aggressive armored thrusts of the German Ardennes offensive. Fast, heavily armed, and already beginning to starve. La Gleize was not meant to be a destination. It was meant to be a waypoint. A brief pause before pressing west, a place to refuel, reorganize, and move on. But the war had other plans. German armored units, pushing hard toward the Meuse River, had advanced faster than their supply lines could follow. Roads behind them were clogged, bombed, frozen, or cut off. Fuel trucks never arrived. Bridges were destroyed before convoys could cross. The snow hid wreckage that forced detours measured not in miles, but in hours. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, momentum began to drain away. By the time German forces entered La Gleize, they were already operating on borrowed time. Tanks rolled into the village with engines that had been running too long. Crews watched their fuel gauges with quiet dread. Half-tracks stalled at intersections. Orders became urgent, then conflicting. Maps were studied again and again beneath dim light, routes traced with fingers stiff from cold. The village filled with vehicles. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, trucks, packed into streets never designed to hold such weight. Above it all, the weather began to change. For days, low clouds and snow had shielded the German advance from Allied air power. But winter does not stay still forever. The sky began to clear in broken patches, revealing pale blue above white ground. And with that clearing came the distant sound no one wanted to hear. Aircraft engines, faint at first, then unmistakable. La Gleize became exposed. Allied fighter bombers swept down over the roads leading into and out of the village, attacking anything that moved. Vehicles burned where they stood. Columns were shattered. Retreat routes narrowed. What had been a forward thrust became a bottleneck of steel and desperation. German units tried to push onward, only to find bridges gone and fuel exhausted. They tried to pull back, only to discover the roads behind them were no longer safe. The village filled with tension. Civilians hid in cellars as explosions shook stone walls above them. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, smoke drifted through narrow streets already crowded with immobilized armor. The sound of artillery echoed off surrounding hills, bouncing back into the valley until direction lost meaning. Night brought no relief, only darker uncertainty as fires lit the snow in dull orange pulses. At the center of it all, command decisions grew heavier by the hour. Should the tanks be held and defended in place, turning La Gleize into a fortress? Should they attempt a breakout with what fuel remained? Should the vehicles be destroyed to save the men? Every option carried loss. As American units advanced from multiple directions, pressure tightened around the village. Infantry moved cautiously through woods thick with snow. Artillery was brought forward to dominate the roads. Reconnaissance units probed the edges of German positions, testing for weakness. The trap did not close suddenly. It closed slowly, methodically, with patience sharpened by experience. Inside La Gleize, the reality became unavoidable. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was limited. Movement was impossible. The tanks that had once symbolized power now sat silent, their engines cold, their armor useless without mobility. Crews stripped them of weapons and supplies. Some prepared demolition charges. Others simply sat beside their vehicles, hands numb, staring at steel they would never drive again. When the order finally came to abandon the heavy equipment and escape on foot, it carried no drama, only exhaustion. Under cover of darkness, small groups slipped away from the village, moving through snow-covered fields and forests, leaving behind the machines that had carried them this far. The Tigers and Panthers remained, hulking and still, frozen into the landscape like monuments to a gamble that had run out of time. La Gleize was left behind, scarred, silent, and littered with the remains of ambition. By morning, the village stood as evidence of how modern war can grind to a halt, not through a single decisive blow, but through accumulation of delays, shortages, weather, resistance, and reality. The Battle of La Gleize was not a sweeping clash of armies. It was a collapse compressed into a small place, where strategy met limitation and could go no further. Tonight, we return to that village, to the frozen roads clogged with steel, to the quiet panic of fuel gauges reading empty, to the moment when movement stopped and decisions became survival, to La Gleize, where one of the Ardennes offensive's most aggressive thrusts finally ran out of ground. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something calm and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? Is it late and quiet, or is the night just beginning to soften? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the Battle of La Gleize reminds us that sometimes the end does not come with impact, but with stillness, when forward motion simply cannot continue. In your own life, has there ever been a moment when stopping, even unwillingly, changed the direction of everything? If it feels right, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, steady journeys into the quieter turning points of histories help your breathing slow, your thoughts settle, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. December 17th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The fog hung thick over the cobblestone streets of Stavelot, Belgium, like a funeral shroud draped across the sleeping town. In the cellar of the Kaiser Baraki farmhouse, Marie Solheide woke to a sound she'd never heard before, a deep mechanical rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. The 8-year-old girl climbed the cellar stairs in darkness, pressed her face against the frost-covered window, and saw shapes moving through the mist, shapes too large to be trucks, too loud to be anything she'd ever known. Within minutes, the entire village would understand what those shapes meant. The war, which had seemed so distant for months, had arrived at their doorstep with the roar of diesel engines and the grinding of steel treads. What Marie couldn't know, what none of the villagers could possibly comprehend, was that her small farming community was about to become the stage for one of the most desperate battles of World War II. The column that rolled through Stavelot that frozen morning was unlike anything the American forces in the Ardennes had encountered. This wasn't a reconnaissance patrol or a probing attack. This was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Approximately 4,800 men, 117 armored vehicles, 30 massive Panther tanks with their sloped frontal armor that could deflect most American shells, 6 King Tiger tanks, the heaviest operational tanks in the world, each weighing 70 tons and mounting an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. 149 half-tracks carrying battle-hardened SS troops who'd survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. The objective was audacious to the point of madness: penetrate 90 kilometers through American lines, seize the bridges over the Meuse River, and drive all the way to Antwerp. The timeline? 50 hours. The orders? No prisoners, no delays, no mercy. But before we understand why this column would end up trapped in the small village of La Gleize, we need to understand how it got there in the first place. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was Hitler's desperate attempt to reverse the tide of the war. On December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route Germany had used to invade France in 1940. The Americans had dismissed this sector as a quiet zone, a place to rest exhausted divisions and blood-inexperienced ones. Intelligence officers had ignored reports of German armor concentrations, dismissing them as defensive redeployments. When the attack came, it caught the Allies completely by surprise. Within 24 hours, German forces had torn a 50-kilometer gap in American lines. Panic spread through Allied headquarters. The Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, faced the possibility that his entire Northern Army group might be cut off and destroyed. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe was the tip of this spear, the fastest and most powerful unit in the entire 6th Panzer Army. Their route took them through a narrow corridor of forest roads and small bridges, threading between American positions in a race against time and fuel consumption. The The Panthers and King Tigers were magnificent war machines, but they were also desperately thirsty. A Panther consumed approximately 1.5 gallons of fuel per mile. The King Tigers were even worse. Peiper had begun the offensive with barely enough fuel for 100 kilometers, less than half the distance to his objective. His plan relied on capturing American fuel depots along the way. If he didn't, if the bridges were blown before he could seize them, if the Americans reacted faster than expected, the entire operation would collapse. But in those first heady hours, as his column smashed through scattered American resistance, such concerns seemed distant. The road to the Meuse lay open. Victory seemed within reach. The crossing at Stavelot was Peiper's lifeline. The bridge over the Amblève River was the only crossing for kilometers in either direction. The river cut through a gorge 200 feet deep with nearly vertical sides. Impossible to ford. Impossible to bridge under fire. If that single span was destroyed, Peiper's supply line would be severed. Every shell, every liter of fuel, every replacement would have to come across that bridge. The Americans had engineers in the area, elements of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, fewer than 300 men tasked with maintaining roads and bridges in a sector everyone had considered safe. When the reports started coming in, fragmentary, confused, terrifying, about a massive German column breaking through, these engineers faced an impossible decision. Do they blow the bridges and risk trapping American units on the wrong side? Do they wait for confirmation and risk letting the Germans through? Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin made the call. Wire every bridge for demolition, but don't blow them until German tanks are in sight. The civilians of Stavelot and the surrounding villages had no such tactical considerations. They simply tried to survive. When the first German tanks appeared, many villagers assumed this was a local counterattack, nothing more. Some even came out of their homes to watch the column pass, curiosity overcoming caution. The German soldiers ignored them at first, focused on maintaining their rapid advance. But as the column stretched through the town, as more and more vehicles poured across the bridge, the mood changed. SS troops began pounding on doors, demanding food, wine, warm clothing. Some residents were forced from their homes at gunpoint, made to shelter elsewhere so German soldiers could use their houses. Others were ordered to remain indoors, threatened with execution if they were seen on the streets. The liberation they had celebrated in September, when American forces had driven out the Germans, now seemed like a cruel dream. Occupation had returned, and this time it carried the desperation of an army that knew it was losing. Marie Solheim and her family huddled in their cellar with 40 neighbors as the tank column passed overhead. The house shook with each vehicle. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. The noise was so loud that conversation became impossible. People could only stare at each other with wide eyes, waiting for it to end. But it didn't end. Hour after hour, the column kept coming. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, trucks, self-propelled guns. The sheer scale of it seemed impossible. How could the Americans, who had seemed so powerful just months ago, allow such a force to penetrate so deeply? Where were the American tanks, the fighter bombers, the artillery that had smashed German counterattacks all autumn? The answer, though the civilians couldn't know it, was simple and terrible. The Americans had been caught completely unprepared. The quiet sector had become a killing ground. By mid-morning on December 17th, Peiper's column had pushed beyond Stavelot and was racing west toward Trois Ponts, where 3 rivers met and 3 bridges offered routes deeper into Belgium. American commanders were beginning to grasp the scope of the disaster. Radio operators at First Army headquarters in Spa were receiving reports that made no sense. German armor and strength at locations 30 kilometers behind the front lines. How was that possible? General Courtney Hodges, the First Army commander, initially refused to believe the reports. Some of his staff thought the transmissions might be German deception, English-speaking commandos spreading false information. It took nearly 6 hours for the high command to accept that a major German offensive was underway, and by then Peiper had already advanced 40 kilometers. The response, when it finally came, was chaotic but determined. Every available unit would be thrown into Peiper's path. Engineers would blow bridges. Infantry would establish blocking positions. Tank destroyers would set up ambushes. The goal wasn't to destroy the German column, not yet. The goal was simply to slow it down. At Trois Ponts, Sergeant Jean Miller of the 200 d'Armes 91st Engineers waited with his hand on a plunger detonator. He'd wired the bridge with 290 pounds of TNT, enough to drop the 85-foot span into the Somme River. His orders were clear: blow the bridge when German tanks came into sight. But Miller could hear the column approaching long before he could see it. The grinding of tracks on cobblestones, the roar of diesel engines, the squeal of metal on metal as the massive vehicles navigated the narrow streets. He waited, sweat freezing on his face despite the cold, knowing that if he blew the bridge too early, he'd be court-martialed, and if he waited too late, the Germans would kill him. At 11:30 a.m., the lead Panther rounded the corner 400 meters away. Miller saw the long barrel of its 75mm gun traverse toward his position. He saw German infantry dismounting from half-tracks. He slammed down the plunger. The bridge erupted in a column of smoke and debris, the roadway section collapsing into the river with a sound like thunder. The Panther slid to a halt 25 meters from the gap, its commander standing in the turret, staring at the destruction with visible fury. Peiper's advance had hit its first real obstacle, but the battle for La Gleize was only beginning. Forced to turn north, searching for another crossing, the German column would find itself channeled into an ever-narrowing corridor. Behind them, American forces were recovering from the initial shock, rushing reinforcements toward the breakthrough. Ahead, more bridges were being wired for demolition, more ambush positions prepared, and in the hills above the Amblève River Valley, in a small farming village called La Gleize, the terrain and the calendar were about to conspire to transform Peiper's lightning advance into a desperate siege. The civilians going about their daily routines on December 17th had no idea that within 24 hours, their village would become the focal point of one of the war's most savage battles. They didn't know that the column passing through the valley below would soon be trapped in their streets. They couldn't imagine that by Christmas, La Gleize would cease to exist as anything more than a name on a map and a graveyard of shattered stone. December 16th, 1944. 4:30 in the morning. In a farmhouse commandeered as a forward headquarters somewhere in the German-held territory east of the Belgian border, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper gathered his company commanders for a final briefing. The room smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and the peculiar tension that precedes combat. Peiper, at 29 years old, looked more like a university professor than a veteran of the Eastern Front. Sharp features, intelligent eyes, a quiet intensity that made men listen when he spoke. He spread a map across the wooden table and traced the route with his finger. Losheimer Graben, Honsfeld, Boulingen, Leineuville, Stavelot, Trois Ponts, then across the Meuse and on to Antwerp, 90 kilometers in 50 hours. His officers studied the map in silence, doing the mathematics in their heads. It was possible, barely, if everything went perfectly. When Peiper finished his tactical overview, he added one more instruction, spoken in the same calm tone he'd used to describe road junctions and fuel stops. There will be no prisoners of war. Time is more important than booty. To understand what happened at La Gleize, you must first understand the man who led the German column into that trap. Joachim Peiper was the embodiment of everything both impressive and horrifying about the Waffen-SS. Brilliant tactician, utterly ruthless, personally brave to the point of recklessness, completely indoctrinated in Nazi ideology. He'd joined the SS at age 19, attracted by the elite status and the promise of being part of Hitler's new order. By age 23, he was serving as an adjutant to Heinrich Himmler himself, the architect of the Holocaust, attending meetings where the extermination of entire populations was discussed as casually as logistics planning. In 1943, Peiper took command of a tank battalion in the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard unit. On the Eastern Front, he had earned a reputation for audacious attacks and complete disregard for conventional tactics. He'd also earned a reputation for something else. His units left burned villages and executed prisoners in their wake. The doctrine Peiper embodied had a German phrase, Augen zu und durch, close your eyes and break through. It meant speed over consolidation, audacity over caution, accepting casualties to maintain momentum. In the fluid battles of the Eastern Front, where vast distances and weak enemy positions allowed for sweeping maneuvers, this approach had worked brilliantly. Peiper's battalion had punched through Soviet lines again and again, exploiting breakthroughs before the enemy could react. But the Ardennes wasn't the Eastern Front. The roads were narrower, the bridges were smaller. The Americans, once they recovered from the initial shock, would prove far better equipped and organized than the shattered Soviet units Peiper had faced in 1943. And there was one other critical difference. On the Eastern Front, atrocities against civilians and prisoners barely raised eyebrows in the barbaric war both sides were fighting. In Western Europe, there were still rules. There were still consequences. Peiper was about to discover that the tactics that had made him a hero in the East would make him a war criminal in the West. The Malmedy massacre happened on December 17th at 11:30 in the morning in a snow-covered field at a crossroads south of the town of Malmedy. Peiper's lead elements had captured approximately 120 American soldiers from the 728th Field Artillery Battalion, troops who'd been caught on the road during the German advance. The Americans were disarmed, searched, and herded into the field. Then, without warning, German machine guns opened fire. Men fell in rows. Those who ran were hunted down. Those who played dead were shot where they lay. 84 Americans died in that field. Some survived by hiding under the bodies of their comrades, lying motionless as German soldiers walked among the corpses, firing insurance rounds into anyone who looked alive. When the shooting finally stopped, the survivors waited until the German column had moved on, then fled to American lines with a story that would shock the Allied world and seal Peiper's fate. Peiper later claimed he wasn't present at Malmedy, that the massacre was carried out without his knowledge by subordinates acting on their own initiative. This was almost certainly a lie. His own operations officer testified that the order about prisoners came directly from Peiper. Multiple survivors reported seeing a German officer matching Peiper's description at the scene, and the massacre wasn't an isolated incident. At Honsfeld, 19 American prisoners were shot. At Bullingen, 8 more. At Stavelot, 44 American soldiers and Belgian civilians were killed after capture. The pattern was clear. Peiper's Kampfgruppe was operating under orders to take no prisoners and to eliminate anyone who might slow their advance. Whether these orders originated with Peiper, with his division commander, or with higher headquarters would be debated for decades. What cannot be debated is that the atrocities happened, repeatedly, and that Peiper did nothing to stop them. But Peiper's moral failings shouldn't obscure his tactical abilities, because understanding his skill is essential to understanding why the Americans struggled so desperately to stop him. At Trois Ponts, when the bridge demolition blocked his primary route, Peiper didn't pause to consolidate or wait for orders. Within 30 minutes, he'd dispatched reconnaissance teams to find alternate crossings, redirected his column north toward Chanou, and radioed back for bridging equipment in case he needed to force a crossing. When American infantry established a hasty defensive position at Lavenne, Peiper didn't waste time with artillery preparation. He simply attacked with tanks and infantry together, overwhelming the position through speed and violence. The Americans retreating from Lavenne reported facing an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move, who exploited every hesitation, who never gave them time to organize a coherent defense. This was Blitzkrieg doctrine at its purest. Keep moving, keep the enemy off balance, never let them recover. By the evening of December 17th, Peiper's column had covered 45 kilometers in less than 15 hours. They'd captured the fuel depot at Bullingen, adding precious liters to their tanks. They'd bypassed strong American positions through sheer speed and aggressive route selection. They'd spread panic throughout the American rear areas. First Army headquarters in Spa was preparing to evacuate, staff officers burning documents and packing vehicles. For a few hours, it seemed like Peiper might actually pull off the impossible, but the fuel gauges told a different story. The Panthers were down to a quarter tank. The King Tigers were worse. Those 70-ton monsters consumed fuel at an appalling rate. And ahead, unknown to Peiper, American engineers were working frantically at every bridge along every possible route to the Meuse. The race was no longer between the German column and the American response. It was between Peiper's fuel supply and the American demolition charges. At the crossroads in Chanou, Peiper faced a critical decision. His scouts reported that the direct route west was blocked, bridges blown, American infantry digging in. The route north toward La Gleize appeared open, with intelligence suggesting another bridge over the Amblève at Neuf-Moulins. If he could seize that bridge intact, he could swing west from La Gleize and resume his drive to the Meuse. If the bridge was blown, he'd be trapped in the high ground with his back to the river. Peiper studied his maps in the turret of his command half-track, weighing options. Every minute of delay meant more American reinforcements arriving, more defensive positions being prepared. But rushing blindly forward risked driving his column into a dead end. Finally, he made the call. North to La Gleize. Secure the village. Seize the Neuf Moulins Bridge. Resume the advance at first light. It was a tactically sound decision based on the information available. It was also the decision that would doom his entire Kampfgruppe. The column that rolled into La Gleize on the evening of December 17th was tired but triumphant. They'd broken through the American lines. They'd captured fuel and supplies. They'd advanced farther in one day than any German unit had managed since the collapse of France in 1940. The SS troops dismounted from their vehicles, requisitioned the largest buildings for command posts and billets, and settled in for what they assumed would be a brief rest before resuming the offensive. Some looted Belgian homes for food and wine, others simply collapsed in exhaustion, having been awake and fighting for nearly 40 hours straight. Peiper established his headquarters in the Château de Froidcourt, a manor house on the edge of the village with a commanding view of the valley. From the chateau's windows, he could see the road to Neuilly snaking down the hillside. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow we cross the Amblève and drive for the Meuse. He had no way of knowing that American engineers had blown the Neuf Moulins Bridge 3 hours earlier. He had no way of knowing that the biggest airborne division in the American army was at that very moment racing north to cut him off. Joachim Peiper had pushed farther and faster than any other German commander in the Ardennes offensive. His audacity had torn a hole in American lines and spread panic through Allied headquarters. His tactical brilliance had overcome obstacle after obstacle, but brilliance and audacity cannot overcome logistics, and logistics were about to become Peiper's executioner. The fuel crisis that had worried him since the start of the offensive was about to become catastrophic. The bridges he needed to continue his advance were already destroyed, and the brief rest in La Gleize was about to become a 6-day siege that would destroy his Kampfgruppe and transform an obscure Belgian farming village into one of the most famous battlefields of World War II. Peiper, the master of mobile warfare, was about to learn that when momentum stops, when the blitzkrieg stalls, even the most elite troops become just another group of men waiting to die. December 15th, 1944. The Officers' Club in Spa, Belgium. American staff officers from 1st Army Headquarters were enjoying an evening of relative normalcy, drinks, conversation, a break from the grinding monotony of the war that everyone assumed was almost won. The Ardennes sector had been quiet for months. The Germans were clearly beaten, their army shattered by the grinding battles in France, their industrial capacity destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was scraping together reserves for a last-ditch defense of the Rhine, nothing more. So, the officers in Spa that evening felt justified in their confidence. Some were planning Christmas leave, others discussed the inevitable victory parade in Berlin. None of them, not a single one, suspected that less than 40 kilometers to the east, 200,000 German troops were moving into attack positions for the largest offensive Germany would launch in the entire war. The failure of American intelligence in December 1944 ranks among the most catastrophic in military history, and it was about to cost thousands of lives. The Ardennes had been designated a quiet sector for very specific reasons, but none of those reasons had anything to do with German intentions. After the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest and around Aachen, American divisions needed rest and replacement. The Ardennes, with its forests and hills and few strategic objectives, seemed like the perfect place to rotate exhausted units out of combat and blood-inexperienced divisions before sending them into more critical sectors. The 99th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States with no combat experience, held positions in the northern shoulder. The 106th Infantry Division, equally green, defended the center. The 4th Infantry Division, battered from months of combat, recuperated in the south. These weren't elite formations. They weren't equipped for a major defensive battle. They were, quite simply, the divisions. The American command could afford to risk in a sector where nothing was expected to happen. The intelligence failure that allowed the German offensive to achieve complete surprise was built on layers of assumption, wishful thinking, and institutional arrogance. Ultra intercepts, the The decrypted German radio messages that had given the Allies such an advantage throughout the war suggested that Germany was assembling armor in the West, but analysts interpreted this as preparation for countering an Allied offensive, not launching one. Aerial reconnaissance detected increased German activity in the forests east of the Ardennes, but bad weather had limited photo coverage, and what images existed were misread. German troops were spotted moving through villages at night, but this was explained as normal troop rotations. Most critically, Allied intelligence had convinced itself that Germany no longer possessed the resources for a major offensive. The fuel shortages, the manpower crisis, the cratering industrial production, all the data said that Germany was finished. So, when evidence appeared that contradicted this conclusion, that evidence was dismissed or explained away. On December 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, the truth arrived in the form of the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since 1918. More than 1,500 German guns opened fire simultaneously along an 80-kilometer front. American positions were obliterated. Communication lines were severed. Observation posts were destroyed. Then came the infantry, waves of German troops emerging from the morning fog, overrunning shocked American defenders who'd been eating breakfast or sleeping in their foxholes. The green divisions in the center of the line simply disintegrated. Entire regiments cut off, surrounded, forced to surrender. The more experienced 4th Infantry Division in the south held, but barely. And in the north, where Peiper's Kampfgruppe was driving through the gap, there was almost nothing to stop them. American headquarters received fragmentary, contradictory reports. German infantry attacking in the north, German armor penetrating in the center. Paratroopers, false reports, but believed at the time, landing in the rear areas. It took 12 hours for commanders to grasp that this wasn't a local counterattack. This was a full-scale offensive aimed at splitting the Allied armies and recapturing Antwerp. The officers who would have to stop Peiper's column were, in those first crucial hours, operating almost completely blind. Major Paul Solis of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received his first warning of the German breakthrough around 8 a.m. on December 16th, when a military policeman stopped his jeep and told him about Germans in the area. Germans in the area? Solis had spent the previous week building showers for rear area troops. His battalion wasn't equipped or trained for combat. They had light, weapons, demolitions, and construction equipment. The idea that they would be expected to fight an SS Panzer division seemed absurd, but as reports continued to come in throughout the morning, German armor at Hoensfeld, at Bullingen, pushing towards Stavelot, Solis realized that absurd or not, his engineers were the only American troops between Peiper's column and the Meuse River. He began issuing orders: gather all available explosives, wire every bridge for demolition, prepare to blow them on short notice. The chaos of those first days was captured in countless small moments of confusion and improvisation. Troops from shattered units streaming west, telling wild stories of Tigers and SS troops and villages overrun in minutes. Headquarters staff officers packing files and evacuating, sometimes before the frontline troops even knew there was a crisis. Supply convoys turning around in panic when they encountered German roadblocks. And everywhere, the desperate scramble to find units, any units, that could be thrown into the gap. The 82nd Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, were resting near Reims in France when they received movement orders on December 17th. Nobody told them where they were going or why. They loaded into trucks and headed north, paratroopers in summer uniforms riding through freezing rain, toward a battle they knew nothing about. The 30th Infantry Division, another veteran formation, was pulled from the line and rushed toward Stavelot. Tank destroyer battalions were split up and sent to different road junctions. Artillery batteries found themselves firing missions without any idea where their own infantry was. It wasn't a coordinated defense, it was organized chaos. For the American troops actually in contact with Peiper's column, the experience was terrifying. The 99th Infantry Division soldiers who first encountered King Tiger tanks had never seen anything like them. Their standard anti-tank weapon, the 2.36-inch bazooka, bounced rounds off the Tiger's frontal armor without effect. The few American tanks in the area, mostly M4 Shermans with 75mm guns, were hopelessly outmatched. A Sherman could kill a panther or tiger, but only with a flank shot at close range, and getting into position for such a shot usually meant exposing yourself to that 88mm gun that could kill you from 2,000 meters away. The psychological impact of facing such technological superiority was crushing. Men who'd fought bravely against normal German tanks broke and ran when the King Tigers appeared. Even experienced troops felt the cold hand of fear when they saw those massive shapes emerging from the fog. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, commanding the 291st Engineers, became one of the unsung heroes of the early battle through a combination of initiative and desperation. When he received orders to prepare bridges for demolition, he realized he had a critical shortage. Not enough electrical detonators. Army supply couldn't help. The offensive had disrupted everything. So, Pergrin sent his men scrounging through rear area dumps and abandoned positions, gathering whatever explosives and detonators they could find. Some bridges would be blown with proper electrical systems. Others would use improvised time fuses. A few would require someone to light a literal fuse and run. It was amateur hour in the worst possible circumstances, but Pergrin made it work. When Peiper's column reached Trois Ponts on December 18th, the bridges were ready. When the lead panther came into view, Sergeant John Miller was waiting with his finger on the plunger. The bridge dropped into the river precisely as planned, a small victory born of desperation and improvisation. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, finally grasped the full scope of the crisis on December 18th. His headquarters in Spa was less than 15 kilometers from the front line, well within range of Peiper's column. German tanks had been reported at Stavelot. If they broke through toward Spa, they could capture or kill the entire First Army staff. Hodges made the agonizing decision to evacuate. Staff officers burned documents, packed vehicles, and headed west toward safer positions. The evacuation was orderly, professional, but it sent a psychological shock through the entire command. If First Army headquarters was running, how bad was the situation? Rumors spread faster than facts. Some units reported that Spa had fallen. Others claimed German paratroopers had captured American generals. The fog of war was so thick that separating truth from panic was nearly impossible. But through the chaos, certain facts became clear. The Germans had achieved a major breakthrough. One armored column had penetrated dangerously deep, and every available unit was being thrown into the gap to stop them. The unpreparedness of the American forces in December 1944 was a product of success. After the breakout from Normandy, the race across France, the liberation of Paris and Brussels, the Americans had begun to believe their own propaganda. The Germans were finished. The war was almost won. This confidence had consequences. Intelligence officers discounted warning signs. Defensive sectors were held with minimal forces. The possibility of a major German offensive was simply dismissed as impossible. And so, when that impossible offensive came, the response was improvised, chaotic, and desperately inadequate. The fact that the Americans eventually stopped the German advance, that they turned near disaster into victory, makes it easy to forget how close it came to catastrophe. On December 17th and 18th, 1944, the outcome was very much in doubt. And if Joachim Peiper's column had found just one bridge intact, if they'd captured just a bit more fuel, if American engineers had been just a few minutes slower with their demolitions, the entire Ardennes offensive might have succeeded. The battle for La Gleize would be won, not by the prepared and the competent, but by the desperate and the lucky. December 18th, 1944. 11:28 a.m. Sergeant Jean Miller crouched behind a low stone wall 300 meters from the bridge at Trois Ponts, his right hand resting on a plunger detonator connected by electrical wire to 290 pounds of TNT packed beneath the bridge's center span. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Miller's breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. He could hear the German column approaching long before he could see it. The distinctive high-pitched whine of Maybach engines, the metallic clatter of tank treads on cobblestones, the rumble of vehicles so heavy they made the ground vibrate. His orders were crystal clear. Blow the bridge when German tanks come into visual range, not before. Blow it too early, and you'd be court-martialed for destroying vital infrastructure without cause. Wait too long, and you'd be dead, killed by the same tanks you were supposed to stop. Miller watched the road, his hand steady on the plunger despite the fear knotting his stomach. Then the lead Panther tank rounded the corner. Miller slammed the plunger down. The explosion was tremendous, a crack of thunder followed by a roiling cloud of smoke and debris. The bridge's center span, 85 feet of reinforced concrete and steel, lifted into the air and then collapsed into the Somme River 40 feet below. The roadway simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gap too wide for any vehicle to cross. The Panther skidded to a halt 25 meters from the edge, its commander standing in the turret staring at the destruction. German infantry dismounted from half-tracks and rushed toward the riverbank, weapons ready, but there was nothing to do. The bridge was gone. The only structure capable of supporting 70-ton tanks across the Somme River had just become a pile of rubble and twisted metal in the river below. Peiper's column, which had seemed unstoppable for the past 2 days, had just hit an obstacle it could not overcome through speed or firepower. For the first time since the offensive began, the Germans had to stop. They had to think. They had to find another way. The bridge at Trois Ponts was the first of 3 critical demolitions that would seal Peiper's fate. But to understand why these bridges mattered so much, you need to understand the geography of the Ardennes. This isn't flat tank country. This is a landscape of steep valleys carved by fast-flowing rivers, of ridgelines covered in dense forest, of roads that twist through terrain that channelizes movement and makes every bridge a choke point. The Amblève River and its tributaries create a natural barrier running east to west through the region. The rivers themselves aren't particularly wide, 30 to 40 meters in most places, but they flow through gorges with sides so steep they might as well be cliffs. A tank can ford a shallow stream. It cannot climb a 200-foot vertical rock face. So the bridges weren't just convenient crossing points. They were the only crossing points. Destroy them, and an armored column becomes trapped in whatever valley or plateau it happens to occupy. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin had spent December 16th and 17th in a state of controlled panic, racing from bridge to bridge, supervising demolition preparations while trying to figure out where the German column actually was and where it was heading. His 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been scattered across the Ardennes, maintaining infrastructure. Now those same engineers were being tasked with destroying that infrastructure to slow an enemy advance. At Trois Ponts, the calculations were straightforward. A bridge of that size required a certain amount of explosive placed at specific structural points to ensure complete collapse. But at other locations, the engineers were improvising. At the Habillement Bridge, they had to place charges while under direct fire from German infantry advancing through the woods. At Neumoulin, they'd blown the bridge with German assault troops, literally on the structure, the explosion sending bodies tumbling into the gorge along with the wreckage. The demolition at Habillement was perhaps the most desperate of all. The bridge was smaller than the one at Trois Ponts, a narrow span over a tributary of the Amblève, but it offered Peiper an alternate route if he moved quickly enough. A squad of engineers worked frantically to place charges, while German machine gun fire kicked up dirt around them. One engineer was hit, a bullet through his shoulder, but kept working, wrapping det cord around support beams with his good arm. Another realized they didn't have enough electrical detonator cord to reach a safe distance, so they rigged a time fuse instead. Light it, and you have 90 seconds to get clear before the bridge explodes. The squad leader, a sergeant whose name was lost to history, lit the fuse and then turned to sprint away. He made it about 50 meters before the explosion lifted him off his feet and threw him into a ditch. When he climbed out, dazed and deafened, the bridge was gone, and so were the Germans, pulled back from the blast zone. The sergeant walked back to American lines with perforated eardrums and a Bronze Star he didn't learn about until weeks later. Peiper's reaction to the bridge demolitions revealed both his tactical brilliance and his growing desperation. At Trois Ponts, he didn't waste time trying to force a crossing or waiting for bridging equipment. Within 30 minutes of the bridge blowing, he'd redirected his entire column north toward La Gleize, gambling that he could find another crossing there or at Chenu. When scouts reported the Neuf-Moulins Bridge destroyed, he shifted again, probing for any gap in the American defensive line. This kind of fluid maneuvering, this constant adaptation to changing circumstances, was exactly what German armored doctrine emphasized. But each change of route burned fuel. Each detour put more distance between Peiper's vanguard and his supply line, and each hour of delay gave the Americans more time to reinforce, to prepare, to tighten the noose. By the evening of December 18th, Peiper's situation had transformed from promising to precarious. The War Council that evening at the Château de Froidcourt in La Gleize had an air of unreality about it. Peiper and his officers studied maps by candlelight. Electric power in the village had been knocked out by American artillery. They knew that all routes west were blocked. The bridges at Trois Ponts, Habier-Mont, and Neuf Moulins were destroyed. American infantry was digging into the south and west. German attempts to break through at Stavelot had been repulsed. The radio brought only bad news. 6th Panzer Army's advance had stalled all along the line, no breakthrough to the Meuse, no exploitation of Peiper's initial penetration. One of the officers suggested abandoning the vehicles and attempting to infiltrate back to German lines on foot. Peiper rejected this immediately. They would hold La Gleize and wait for relief. The rest of 1st SS Panzer Division would break through the American lines at Stavelot. Supplies would be airlifted in. The offensive would resume. It had to. The alternative was unthinkable. The fuel situation by evening on December 18th told the real story. The Panthers were down to 15 to 20% capacity. The King Tigers were worse. Those massive vehicles consumed fuel so voraciously that even with the captured American supplies from Bulge, they were running on fumes. Peiper's operations officer calculated that the Kampfgruppe had enough fuel for perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers of movement, total, for the entire column. If they tried to break out to the west, they'd run dry before reaching the Meuse. If they tried to fight their way back east to German lines, they'd be immobilized halfway there. The only option was to stay put, establish defensive positions, and hope that relief arrived before the Americans attacked in force. It was a gamble. It was also the only play left on the board. Peiper ordered his tank commanders to position their vehicles, to cover the approaches to the village, to dig in the infantry, to prepare for a siege. The 3 bridges, Trois Ponts, Habier-Mont, Neuf Moulins, were tiny structures by the standards of modern engineering. Simple concrete and steel spans, each less than 100 meters long, built in the 1920s and 30s to connect rural communities. They weren't designed to support military traffic. They weren't fortified or defended. They were just ordinary bridges in an ordinary rural area. But their destruction changed the entire trajectory of the Battle of the Bulge. If any one of those bridges had survived intact, Peiper could have resumed his drive to the Meuse. If he had reached the Meuse, if he had seized a crossing there, the entire Allied northern flank would have been threatened. The American response to the Ardennes offensive would have been very different, probably much more costly, possibly unsuccessful. The engineers who blew those bridges, most of them enlisted men, none higher ranking than lieutenant colonel, had no idea they were altering the course of the war. They were just following orders, doing their jobs, trying to slow down an enemy column. But, in doing so, they transformed Joachim Peiper's blitzkrieg into a siege and ensured that La Gleize would become a battlefield. December 19th dawned cold and gray over La Gleize. Peiper's men worked through the morning, strengthening defensive positions, clearing fields of fire, positioning anti-tank weapons to cover the approaches to the village. They could hear American artillery in the distance, not aimed at La Gleize yet, but getting closer. Some of the soldiers were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Kursk and the retreat through Ukraine. They recognized the sound of an enemy gathering strength, preparing for an assault. Others were younger, products of the 1944 recruitment drives, boys who had been taught that Germans were racially superior and therefore destined to win. These youngsters still believed in victory, still thought relief would come, still trusted in Peiper's leadership. The veterans knew better. They'd seen how this ended before. They began writing letters they hoped someone would deliver if they didn't survive. And in the cellars beneath the village, Belgian civilians listened to the sound of preparations for battle and prayed that when the Americans attacked, the shells would fall on German positions and not on their homes. Those prayers would not be answered. December 18th, 1944. 10 p.m. The trucks rolled north through freezing rain, their canvas covers providing almost no protection against the weather. Inside, packed shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division tried to stay warm and failed. These were veterans, survivors of Sicily, Salerno, Normandy, and Market Garden, men who'd jumped from aircraft into enemy fire, who'd held bridges against overwhelming odds, who'd earned a reputation as some of the finest assault infantry in the American Army. But none of that mattered when you're riding in an open truck through sub-freezing temperatures, wearing uniforms designed for summer combat. The men wrapped themselves in blankets scavenged from supply depots. They huddled together for warmth. They cursed the army, the weather, and the Germans in that order. Nobody had told them where they were going or why. The orders had simply come. Load up, move out, head north. Somewhere ahead lay a crisis the regular infantry couldn't handle. Somewhere ahead, the 82nd would be expected to fix a problem that shouldn't exist. Major General James Maurice Gavin, at 37 the youngest division commander in the United States Army, rode in a jeep near the head of the column. He had slightly more information than his troops, but not much. The Germans had launched a major offensive in the Ardennes. American lines were broken. An armored column, size and strength unknown, had penetrated deep into rear areas. The 82nd was being rushed to the town of Werbemont with orders to stop any further German advance toward the Meuse River. Beyond that, details were scarce. Gavin pulled out a map and studied it in the dim light of a flashlight, trying to understand the terrain he'd be fighting in. The Ardennes was nothing like Normandy. No bocage country, no open fields, just ridges and rivers and forests. Good defensive terrain. Terrible terrain for an attacker. If the Germans were dug in, rooting them out would be bloody work. The assembly area at Werbemont was chaos when the 82nd arrived. Trucks and jeeps crowded the narrow roads. Officers shouted orders. Staff sergeants tried to sort their companies into some kind of organization. Nobody knew exactly where the German column was, only that it was somewhere to the east, probably moving toward the Meuse. Gavin established his command post in a school building and immediately demanded better intelligence. Where were the Germans? How many? What were their objectives? The answers that came back were fragmentary and contradictory. German armor at Stavelot, German infantry at Trois Ponts, reports of tigers and panthers everywhere, or maybe nowhere. The fog of war was so thick that separating verified contacts from rumor was nearly impossible. Gavin made a command decision based on terrain rather than intelligence. Position his division on the high ground west and south of La Gleize, blocking the routes to the Meuse. If the Germans wanted to continue their advance, they'd have to come through the 82nd. December 19th, first light. Companies from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment began moving into positions on the ridgelines overlooking La Gleize. The paratroopers were moving light, rifles, ammunition, and not much else. They had left their heavy weapons and most of their equipment in the trucks, expecting to retrieve them once positions were established. What they found when they reached their objectives shocked them. The Germans weren't advancing. They weren't even trying to advance. They were dug in, occupying La Gleize like they intended to stay. Tanks positioned to cover the approaches, machine gun nests in every building, defensive positions that looked like they'd been there for weeks rather than hours. This wasn't a blitzkrieg spearhead. This was a fortress. Captain Charles P. Rowland, commanding Company A of the 500, 4th, sent a patrol forward to probe the German positions. The patrol got within 300 meters before machine gun fire drove them back. One man wounded, no intelligence gained except the confirmation that Peiper's troops were ready for a fight. The tactical situation that developed over December 19th and 20th was unusual for the 82nd Airborne. These men were trained as assault troops, shock infantry expected to attack and seize objectives. But Gavin's orders were clear. Contain the German column, prevent any breakout toward the Meuse, but do not launch major assaults without armor support. The 82nd was good, but they weren't equipped to assault entrenched panzers. So, instead of attacking, they became besiegers. Paratroopers dug foxholes in the frozen ground, a miserable task that took hours with entrenching tools barely making a dent in earth frozen solid. They established observation posts on the high ground, watching German movements in the valley below. They called in artillery missions, directing fire onto German positions. And they waited for tank support, waited for the Germans to try something, waited in foxholes filling with snow as the temperature dropped and the weather turned from merely cold to genuinely dangerous. The equipment situation was dire. The 82nd had deployed so rapidly that normal supply procedures had broken down. Most paratroopers were still wearing their standard uniforms, olive drab wool, designed for European fall weather, not Ardennes winter. A few lucky souls had managed to scrounge heavy overcoats. Most had nothing but their jump jackets and maybe a blanket. Boots weren't insulated. Gloves were in short supply. There were stories of men wrapping their feet in burlap sacks to prevent frostbite. of sentries found frozen to death in their foxholes, having died from exposure rather than enemy action. The official records don't capture the full scope of the suffering, but letters home from survivors paint a grim picture. We're colder than we've ever been, colder than Normandy, colder than we thought possible. Some guys are losing toes. The medics can't keep up. Ammunition resupply was equally chaotic. The 82nd had jumped into Normandy with carefully calculated ammunition loads based on extensive planning. In the Ardennes, they were making do with whatever could be trucked forward over icy roads through a collapsing front line. Rifle ammunition was adequate, machine gun ammunition less so. Anti-tank rockets, the bazookas that might actually hurt a Panther, were in critically short supply. Artillery shells were rationed, each fire mission carefully considered to avoid wasting the limited stocks available. And mortar ammunition, normally the infantry's own organic fire support, was almost non-existent in the first days. The paratroopers adapted, as good infantry always does. They patrolled aggressively to gather intelligence rather than waste ammunition. On speculative firing, they set up ambush positions along the few roads Peiper might use for a breakout. They became experts at calling in artillery fire from the corps-level guns that were being rushed into position. Gavin's tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. Establish a ring around La Gleize from the south and west, prevent any German breakout, and tighten the noose as reinforcements arrived. He positioned the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment directly south of La Gleize, blocking the routes toward Werbemont. The 505th PIR took positions to the west, covering the Trois Ponts approaches. The 508th PIR formed a reserve, ready to reinforce any point where the Germans tried to break out. It was textbook infantry tactics: fix the enemy in place, contain them, and wait for heavier forces to arrive for the kill. But textbook tactics don't account for the human cost of holding positions in a frozen forest while German artillery searches for your foxholes. Textbook tactics don't mention frostbite casualties exceeding combat casualties in the first 2 days. Textbook tactics don't prepare you for watching German tanks maneuver in the valley below, knowing that if they decided to attack up the ridge, your rifle and your one remaining anti-tank rocket wouldn't stop them. The first significant contact came on December 20th, when a German patrol from Peiper's Kampfgruppe probed the American positions south of La Gleize. It wasn't a serious attack, just a reconnaissance in force to identify American positions and strength. But the firefight that erupted was vicious. German machine guns raked the tree line where American foxholes were dug. American rifles and BAR automatic rifles answered. A bazooka team managed to disable a German half-track with a lucky shot to the engine compartment. The skirmish lasted 20 minutes before the Germans pulled back, having accomplished their mission. They now knew the Americans were dug in strength on the high ground. Captain Rowland counted his casualties: 3 dead, 7 wounded, 1 man missing, later found dead from exposure. For a minor contact, the butcher's bill seemed high. It was a preview of what was coming. Gavin spent December 20th visiting his forward positions, talking to company commanders, assessing the situation firsthand. What he saw worried him. The Germans in La Gleize weren't behaving like a defeated force waiting to surrender. They were improving their positions. They were conducting aggressive patrols. Their artillery fire was accurate and disciplined. This was an elite unit that still had fight left in it. Gavin radioed back to Corps headquarters with a blunt assessment. The 82nd could contain the German pocket, but they couldn't eliminate it without significant armored support and probably heavy casualties. The response came back: hold what you've got. The 30th Infantry Division is moving into position north of D. Stavelot. The 3rd Armored Division is en route. Once we have the forces in place, we'll crush the pocket. Until then, don't let Peiper escape. Gavin acknowledged the orders and went back to his command post to study maps and calculate just how many body bags he might need. The psychological shift that occurred in the 82nd between December 19th and 21st was subtle but significant. These paratroopers had spent most of the war on the offensive, attacking German positions, seizing objectives. Now they were defenders, holding ground against a trapped enemy who might at any moment try to break out. It required a different mindset: patience rather than aggression, vigilance rather than audacity. Some men adapted easily, others struggled with the transition, frustrated by the waiting, wanting to attack and finish it. The veterans, the men who'd been through multiple campaigns, understood. You don't assault prepared armor positions without overwhelming superiority. You wait. You let hunger and cold and artillery do the work. You give the enemy time to realize they're beaten. And when they finally try to break out or surrender, that's when you spring the trap. The youngsters, the replacements who joined after Market Garden, didn't understand. They wanted action. They'd get it soon enough, and they'd learn why the veterans preferred to wait. By December 21st, the containment of Peiper's Kampfgruppe was complete from the south and west. The 82nd Airborne held the high ground. Their artillery observers could call fire on any German movement. Their patrols had mapped every approach and escape route. Peiper was surrounded, low on supplies, running out of options. But surrounded doesn't mean defeated, and Gavin knew that. A trapped wolf is still dangerous. An elite SS unit with dozens of operational tanks could inflict terrible casualties if they decided to fight their way out. So, the 82nd continued to dig in, to improve their positions, to wait for the armor and the infantry, and the artillery. The artillery that would transform containment into conquest. In their foxholes on the ridgeline, the paratroopers watched the smoke rising from La Gleize and wondered how many Germans were down there, how hard they'd fight, and how many Americans would die taking a village that most of them had never heard of until 3 days ago. December 19th, 1944. Dawn. Major General Leland Hobbs, commanding the 30th Infantry Division, stared at the map spread across the hood of his Jeep and contemplated a mission that seemed designed to fail. His division, nicknamed Old Hickory after Andrew Jackson, had been pulled from defensive positions and given 48 hours to recapture Stavelot, secure the Amblève River crossings, and cut off the German supply line to Peiper's column in La Gleize. 48 hours. The staff officers had actually said that with straight faces. Hobbs, a veteran of World War I who'd seen his share of impossible orders, just nodded and started issuing commands. The 30th had fought from Normandy to the German border. They'd broken through the Bocage. They'd held against German counterattacks at Mortain. If anyone could pull off this mission, it was Old Hickory. But that didn't mean the mission wasn't insane. It just meant they'd try anyway. The assault on Stavelot began at 8 a.m. on December 19th, with an artillery barrage that walked through the town from east to west, systematically destroying every building that might hold German defenders. The sound was apocalyptic. Dozens of guns firing in sequence, each shell adding to a crescendo of destruction that physically shook the ground. Then came the infantry, squads from the 117th Infantry Regiment moving through the smoke and debris, clearing houses one by one. The Germans defending Stavelot weren't part of Peiper's main force. They were follow-on troops trying to keep the supply line open, but they fought with the desperation of men who knew the entire offensive depended on holding this town. Machine gun nests in stone buildings, snipers in church towers, Panzerfaust teams waiting in cellars to ambush American tanks. Every building became a small fortress, every street a killing ground. The fighting for Stavelot lasted 2 days and cost the 30th Infantry Division nearly 300 casualties. The Germans lost more, exact numbers were never determined, but prisoners reported entire companies being destroyed in the artillery bombardment or cut down by American machine gun fire as they tried to retreat. By the evening of December 20th, American troops controlled most of the town. By December 21st, they controlled all of it. And most importantly, they controlled the bridge over the Amblève, the same bridge that Peiper had crossed on December 17th, his lifeline to German-held territory. Now, American combat engineers prepared to destroy that bridge, the final severing of Peiper's supply line. The demolition charges were placed with almost ceremonial care. At 3 p.m. on December 21st, the bridge that had enabled Peiper's advance was blown into the river gorge. The German column in La Gleize was now truly isolated, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and any possibility of retreat along their original route. While the 30th Infantry fought for Stavelot, other American units were moving into position around La Gleize, like wolves circling wounded prey. The 3rd Armored Division, the same unit that had spearheaded the breakout from Normandy, arrived in the sector on December 20th. Their Shermans and tank destroyers took up positions west of La Gleize, blocking any German move toward the Meuse. Elements of the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, established positions to the north. Combined with the 82nd Airborne's positions to the south and the 30th Infantry at Stavelot, to the east the encirclement was complete, 4 American divisions, approximately 60,000 men, now surrounded Peiper's 4,800 troops. The numerical advantage was overwhelming. The firepower advantage was even more lopsided. American artillery battalions were registering their guns on every approach to La Gleize, every building, every possible German position. The artillery concentration that developed around La Gleize by December 21st was staggering even by World War II standards. 12 artillery battalions, 4 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 6 battalions of 155mm howitzers, and 2 battalions of 8-inch guns had been assigned fire missions in the La Gleize sector. Collectively, these guns could deliver over 5,000 shells per hour if firing at maximum rate. The forward observers positioned on the ridges overlooking La Gleize could call fire on any target within minutes. If a German tank moved, artillery would hit it. If German infantry tried to reinforce a position, artillery would catch them in the open. The Americans were turning the entire village into a killing zone, methodically destroying anything that might support German resistance. The psychological impact on Peiper's men was crushing. The shells never stopped coming, day or night, the randomness of survival turning brave soldiers into shattered wrecks. Peiper's response to encirclement revealed both his tactical skill and his deteriorating situation. He pulled his forces back into a tight defensive perimeter, roughly 2 kilometers in diameter, centered on the village proper. Every building on the perimeter was turned into a strong point. Every street was covered by interlocking fields of fire. His remaining tanks, approximately 40 still operational on December 20th, were positioned in defilade, hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed, making them difficult targets for American artillery. German infantry dug fighting positions in cellars and reinforced basements, anywhere that offered protection from the constant shelling. It was a masterful defensive setup, the kind of position that would cost attackers dearly. But defense doesn't win battles. Defense buys time, and time was something Peiper was rapidly running out of. The radio communications between Peiper and 1st SS Panzer Division headquarters during this period tell a story of growing desperation masked by military formality. December 19th. Request immediate fuel resupply and ammunition. Situation stable, but supplies critical. December 20th. Surrounded. American forces in strength on all sides. Relief essential within 48 hours. December 21st. Ammunition nearly exhausted. No fuel for movement. Relief force must break through immediately. Division headquarters responded with assurances that relief was coming, that supplies would be airdropped, that Peiper just needed to hold on a bit longer. But both sides knew these were comfortable lies. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies. Any attempt to airdrop supplies would be suicide. The relief forces attacking from the east were making no progress against American defenses at Stavelot, and the 48-hour deadline kept getting extended. Hold until tomorrow, hold until the next day, hold just a bit longer. The American command's debate over how to handle the trapped German column revealed competing priorities and philosophies. Some officers argued for an immediate all-out assault, overwhelm the Germans with superior numbers, accept the casualties, finish it quickly. Others advocated patience, tighten the siege, use artillery to destroy German combat power, wait for them to surrender, or attempt a breakout that could be ambushed. General Gavin favored the latter approach. His 82nd Airborne had already lost too many men in frontal assaults during Market Garden, and he wasn't eager to sacrifice more paratroopers charging across open ground into German tanks. General Hobbs of the 30th Infantry was more aggressive, advocating for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The compromise was typical military bureaucracy: maintain containment, increase artillery fire, launch limited probing attacks to identify weak points, and prepare for a major assault if the Germans didn't surrender within a reasonable time frame. The civilians trapped inside the shrinking German perimeter experienced this military chess game as pure terror. As American forces tightened the ring, the safe area within German lines contracted. Families that had been sheltering in homes on the edge of the village were forced to evacuate deeper into the German pocket, crowding into already overcrowded cellars. The artillery fire increased daily. Shells that had been falling on the outskirts were now landing in the village center. The chateau where Peiper had established his headquarters became a field hospital, its wine cellars packed with wounded German soldiers and Belgian civilians alike. Food was scarce. Water had to be fetched from wells while shells were falling. Sanitation was non-existent. Dozens of people sharing basements with no toilets, no privacy, no hope of rescue. And through it all, the constant sound of explosions, the house-shaking impacts of heavy shells, the terrifying randomness of survival. By December 22nd, the strategic situation was clear to anyone with access to the larger picture. Peiper's Kampfgruppe was irrelevant to the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. The 6th Panzer Army's offensive had stalled all along the line. The 5th Panzer Army's advance in the center, the more successful prong of the German offensive, was the focus now. American reinforcements were pouring into the Ardennes. The weather was clearing, allowing Allied air power to devastate German columns. Hitler's gamble had failed. The question was no longer whether Germany would win the Ardennes offensive, but whether they could extract their forces before the trap closed completely. Peiper, cut off and surrounded in La Gleize, was already written off in German planning. He'd served his purpose. His initial advance had drawn American reserves and spread panic through Allied headquarters. Now, he and his men were expendable, sacrificial pawns in a game already lost. The psychological impact of being written off, of knowing you've been abandoned, is devastating for military units. Soldiers will endure extraordinary hardships if they believe their sacrifice serves a purpose. But when that purpose disappears, when it becomes clear that your suffering is pointless, morale collapses. Peiper's veterans could sense the change in tone from division headquarters. The promises of relief became less frequent and less convincing. Radio messages from other units stopped mentioning the relief operation and started discussing defensive consolidation. And the absence of Luftwaffe aircraft overhead, even for reconnaissance, spoke volumes. The SS troops in La Gleize were experienced enough to read the signs. They'd been abandoned. Now they had to decide: die defending a worthless position or find some way to survive the disaster their commanders had created. In his command post in the chateau cellar, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered and reports that no longer changed the outcome, Joachim Peiper faced the same realization. He'd driven farther and faster than any other German commander in the offensive, and it had all been for nothing. December 20th, 1944, 3 p.m. In the cellar of the Kaiserbaracke farmhouse on the western edge of La Gleize, 43 people shared a space designed for storing potatoes. The Kaiserbaracke family, parents, 3 children, grandmother, occupied one corner. Neighbors from 4 surrounding farms filled the rest of the cellar. They'd been there for 3 days, listening to the battle rage overhead, emerging only briefly to fetch water or use the outdoor toilet before scurrying back underground. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and the makeshift latrine buckets that couldn't be emptied while shells were falling. 8-year-old Marie Solheim sat with her mother in the darkness. They'd run out of candles the previous day and tried not to think about how hungry she was. The last real meal had been 2 days ago. Now, they were rationing the bread and cheese that remained, making it last because nobody knew when this nightmare would end. The civilian experience of the Battle of La Gleize is often overlooked in military histories focused on tanks and tactics, but it deserves to be central to any complete telling of the story. La Gleize had a pre-war population of approximately 450 residents, mostly farmers and their families. When the German column arrived on December 17th, many villagers were still in their homes. The battle had moved so quickly that there had been no time for organized evacuation. By December 19th, when the American encirclement was complete, approximately 130 civilians were trapped inside German lines. They hadn't chosen to be there. They had no military value. They were simply people whose homes happened to be in the wrong place when 2 armies collided. What happened to them over the next 6 days would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Germans' treatment of Belgian civilians in La Gleize was opportunistic and brutal. Peiper's troops needed shelter, and they took it. Families were ordered out of their homes so German soldiers could use the buildings. Food stores were requisitioned, the polite word for stolen, to feed troops whose supply line had been cut. Livestock was slaughtered without compensation or apology. Several homes were demolished by German engineers to create clear fields of fire, the residents' possessions simply buried in the rubble. And there were darker incidents, the kind that don't make it into official records but survive in oral histories and testimony. Belgian women reported being assaulted. Belgian men reported being beaten for not producing food or supplies quickly enough. A farmer who protested the killing of his dairy cows was shot in his own barn. His body left where it fell until the battle ended. But the Germans also, paradoxically, needed the civilians alive. When American artillery began systematically bombarding the village, Peiper realized that visible civilian presence might give American gunners pause. German officers instructed Belgian families to remain in the village center, forbidding evacuation attempts. Some historians have characterized this as using civilians as human shields. The truth was probably more complex. The Germans needed the civilians to stay in their cellars for practical reasons like information control, and because moving them would require resources Peiper didn't have. But the effect was the same. Belgian families became hostages, trapped in their homes while artillery rained down, forbidden to leave even as the danger increased exponentially. The death of Madame Grégoire on December 21st became the incident that crystallized civilian terror into outright desperation. She was a 53-year-old schoolteacher, mother of 2 adult children who'd evacuated before the battle. Madame Grégoire had stayed in La Gleize because her elderly mother couldn't be moved. On the afternoon of December 21st, during a brief lull in the artillery fire, she left her cellar to fetch water from the village well. It was a journey she'd made hundreds of times, across the square to the well and back, perhaps 90 meters total. She was filling her bucket when an American 155mm shell landed 20 meters away. The explosion killed her instantly, shrapnel tearing through her body. Her neighbors found her an hour later when someone realized she hadn't returned. They carried her body back to her cellar and laid her next to her still-living mother, who was too deaf to have heard the explosion that killed her daughter. Children's experiences of the battle were particularly traumatic in ways that wouldn't fully manifest for years. Marie Solheide, the 8-year-old girl who'd witnessed the arrival of Peiper's column, later described the constant shelling as the sky tearing itself apart. Another child, 10-year-old Bernard Hanlet, watched his dog get crushed by a retreating German tank. A teenager named André Kaiser Barak helped carry wounded German soldiers into his family's cellar after their aid station was destroyed. The soldiers were barely older than he was, boys of 17 or 18, screaming for their mothers. These were not experiences children were equipped to process. There was no counseling, no therapy, no recognition of psychological trauma in 1944. Children were expected to simply endure, to survive, and then to somehow be normal again when the war ended. The Catholic priest, Abbé Pierre Hanlet, became an unlikely mediator between the German military and the civilian population. On December 20th, Abbé Hanlet approached Peiper directly, walked into the chateau being used as German headquarters, and demanded to see the commander. It took remarkable courage. The abbé had no guarantee he wouldn't be shot as a spy or franc tireur. Peiper, somewhat surprised by this audacity, agreed to meet with him. Abbé Hanlet made a simple request: allow the civilians to evacuate, or at least to gather in the church where the stone walls might provide better protection than residential cellars. Peiper refused the evacuation. He couldn't let civilians pass through American lines with information about German positions and strength. But he agreed to the church shelter, and he gave his word that German troops would not occupy the church building itself, keeping it safe from becoming a military target. The gathering in the church on December 21st brought together approximately 90 civilians, nearly 70% of those trapped in the village. They brought blankets, what food they had left, and memories of a peaceful life that seemed impossibly distant. The church's stone walls were 3 feet thick, offering genuine protection against everything except direct hits from the heaviest shells. Families claimed spaces on the floor, arranging their pathetic possessions into little territories. Abbé Hanlet led prayers morning and evening, not particularly hopeful prayers, but the kind that helped people feel they were doing something, anything, to influence their fate. At night, they could hear the tanks moving outside, the German infantry reinforcing positions, the distant rumble of American artillery preparing for the next bombardment. Some people slept, most just waited in the darkness, wondering which shell would have their name on it. The physical conditions in the church deteriorated rapidly. 90 people, including elderly and children, packed into a space designed to hold perhaps 200 for a 1-hour service. No running water, no toilets, no heat except body warmth, and what little could be generated by burning candles. Food supplies dwindled. Most families had brought only a day or two worth, expecting the battle to end quickly. Hunger became constant. children cried, elderly people sickened. And outside, the battle continued, the sound of explosions so constant that it became almost background noise, noticed only when there was a particularly close impact that showered dust from the ceiling or cracked one of the ancient walls. Years later, survivors would say that the worst part wasn't the fear of death. You became numb to that after a day or two. The worst part was the crushing boredom between moments of terror, the endless hours with nothing to do but wait and listen and pray. By December 23rd, civilian casualties had reached 27 dead and more than 60 wounded. Some died from direct shell hits. Others died from shrapnel injuries that would have been survivable with proper medical care, but became fatal when treatment was limited to improvised bandaging and prayer. A few died from exposure, elderly people whose bodies simply gave up when subjected to days of cold and stress. The wounded were the worst cases. A Belgian teenager with a shrapnel wound to his leg that shattered his femur, screaming in agony while Abbé Hanlet tried to comfort him with prayers because there was no morphine, no doctor, no hope of evacuation to a hospital. A woman with abdominal injuries that were clearly fatal, taking 3 days to die in a church pew while her husband held her hand and told her she'd be fine. The German medics had their own wounded to care for, hundreds of them, and couldn't spare resources for Belgian civilians. When American forces finally liberated La Gleize on Christmas Eve, they found the church full of survivors who could barely speak, traumatized beyond the ability to articulate what they'd experienced. A sergeant from the 82nd Airborne described entering the church. The smell hit you first. Then you saw them, all these people, just staring at us with empty eyes. The children weren't crying. Nobody was talking. They just sat there like they'd forgotten how to be human. The Americans distributed rations, called for medics, began the process of evacuation. But you can't evacuate trauma. You can't ration away the memory of 6 days spent waiting to die while armies fought over your village. The civilians who survived the Battle of La Gleize carried those memories forever. A burden as heavy as any wounded soldiers and far less likely to be recognized or compensated. December 20th, 1944. 7:30 a.m. Captain Charles P. Rowland stood at the edge of a tree line overlooking La Gleize and watched his objective through binoculars with the clinical detachment of a professional who knows he's about to send men to die. Company A of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment had drawn the day's mission: advance across 800 meters of open snow-covered ground, seize the southern edge of La Gleize, and establish a foothold for further attacks. On paper, it seemed straightforward. In practice, Rowland knew it would be suicide. The Germans held the high ground. They had pre-sighted every approach. They had tanks positioned to cover the fields his men would have to cross. But orders were orders, and the 82nd Airborne didn't refuse missions just because they were suicidal. Rowland checked his watch. 8 a.m. attack time, 30 minutes to prepare his men for hell. The plan called for artillery preparation, followed by a 2-company assault. Company A on the left, Company B on the right, with Company C following in reserve to exploit any breakthrough. The artillery barrage began precisely at 7:45, dozens of guns firing in sequence, shells impacting the southern edge of La Gleize in systematic patterns designed to suppress German defensive positions. For 15 minutes, the world disappeared in smoke and explosive thunder. Then silence. The sudden absence of noise was almost more shocking than the barrage had been. Captain Rowland blew his whistle. 200 men stood up from concealment and began walking across the snow toward the German positions. Walking, not running, because you can't run 800 meters through knee-deep snow while carrying weapons and ammunition. Walking toward an enemy who'd had 15 minutes to recover from the artillery and was now aiming machine guns at the approaching Americans. The German response was methodical and devastating. Machine guns opened fire at 600 meters, tracers arcing across the white field like strings of red beads. Americans began falling, not in dramatic Hollywood deaths, but in sudden crumples, men who were walking one moment and lying still in the snow the next. Officers shouted orders to spread out, to find cover, but there was no cover. This was open farmland, nothing but snow and the occasional fence post. The advance continued because stopping meant dying anyway. At least if you kept moving, you had a chance. At 400 meters, German mortars joined the machine guns, shells landing in neat patterns that threw up geysers of frozen earth and torn men. At 300 meters, a Panther tank emerged from a concealed position, and began firing its main gun at individual squads, high explosive shells detonating among clusters of Americans with effects that survivors would never fully describe. Sergeant James Walters of 2nd Platoon made it to within 200 meters of the German line before a machine gun burst caught him across the chest. He fell in the snow, blood spreading in a dark stain that steamed in the cold air. His squad kept decisive, moving, stepping over his body because there was no time to stop, no way to help, nothing to do but keep pushing forward or die where you stood. At 150 meters, some Americans found a shallow depression, probably a drainage ditch, snow-filled and barely a foot deep, but offering some protection. They went to ground there, returning fire with rifles that couldn't reach the German positions, but at least gave them something to do besides wait for the bullet with their name on it. Captain Rowland, following 20 meters behind the assault line, made the call, withdraw. The attack had failed. Continuing would just mean more dead men for no purpose. The withdrawal was almost as costly as the advance. Men who stood up to retreat became targets. German gunners, who had been conserving ammunition during the assault, now opened fire freely at targets silhouetted against the snow. Wounded men who couldn't move on their own were left behind. Combat doctrine said, "Don't risk more casualties retrieving the wounded during an active firefight. Come back for them later if possible." Later turned out to be nightfall, when stretcher parties crawled across the frozen field collecting casualties. They found Sergeant Walters still alive, barely, and got him to an aid station where he died 2 hours later. They found others already dead from their wounds or from exposure, and they found one man, Private Robert Chen, who'd lain in the snow for 11 hours with a shattered leg, too terrified to call out for help because he could hear German patrols nearby. Chen survived, but lost the leg to frostbite and gangrene. The casualty count for Company A that day: 23 killed, 47 wounded, 3 missing presumed dead. Company B, attacking on the right flank, fared only slightly better: 18 killed, 39 wounded. Combined, the two-company assault lost 130 men out of 400 engaged, a 32% casualty rate for exactly 0 gain. Not a single American soldier reached the German defensive line. Not a single German position was captured. The attack accomplished nothing except to demonstrate that frontal assaults against prepared armor positions were suicide, a lesson the Army had supposedly learned in World War I, but apparently needed to relearn at the cost of American lives. The battalion commander who had ordered the attack submitted his after-action report with the clinical language of military bureaucracy. Enemy defenses stronger than anticipated. Mission unsuccessful. Recommend alternative approach. The tank battle that developed on the western edge of La Gleize that same afternoon demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of American armor tactics. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks from the 3rd Armored Division attempted to flank the German positions, moving up a farm track that offered concealment from direct observation. The Shermans were outgunned. Their 75mm guns could penetrate Panther frontal armor only at point-blank range, but they had numbers and better crew training. The American tank commander's plan was to use superior mobility to get into flanking positions where the Sherman's gun could hurt the German tanks. It was a sound plan. It failed because one of the Shermans threw a track on the icy road, blocking the entire column in a narrow defile where they couldn't maneuver. A Panther tank commander, watching from a concealed position 800 meters away, couldn't believe his luck. 5 Sherman tanks stacked up on a narrow road, immobile, perfect targets. He traversed his 88mm gun onto the lead Sherman and fired. The armor-piercing round penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor, the kinetic energy vaporizing metal and turning the crew compartment into a blast furnace. The tank brewed up, tanker slang for catching fire, black smoke pouring from the hatches. The second Sherman tried to reverse, but the narrow road offered no room. Another German round penetrated its turret, killing the gunner and loader instantly. The remaining 3 Sherman crews bailed out and ran, abandoning their vehicles rather than waiting to burn. The Panther methodically destroyed all 5 American tanks, then withdrew before American artillery could range in on his position. Total engagement time, 4 minutes. American casualties, 11 the tankers dead, 7 wounded. German casualties, none. The human cost of December 20th's fighting was captured in the aid stations behind American lines, where medics worked frantically to save men whose wounds exceeded their ability to treat. The battalion aid station was just a farmhouse basement, unheated, lit by kerosene lanterns equipped with whatever medical supplies had been scrounged from division stores. Wounded men lay on the floor, on tables, wherever space could be found. The medics triaged. Those who could be saved with immediate treatment went first. Those who would survive without treatment waited. Those who couldn't be saved were given morphine and set aside to die as comfortably as possible. It was brutal calculus, the mathematics of limited resources and unlimited casualties. A young medic, fresh out of training, broke down crying over a soldier whose abdominal wound was obviously fatal, but who kept asking if he'd be okay. A more experienced medic pulled the youngster aside. "Tell him he'll be fine. It's not a lie if it gives him peace." The psychological impact on the attacking troops was severe. The 82nd Airborne had built its reputation on audacious assaults, Sainte-Mère-Église, the bridges at Nijmegen, but those had been missions where aggressive infantry could make a difference. La Gleize was different. This was infantry attacking armor across open ground, a mission that no amount of courage or training could accomplish without massive casualties and likely failure. The veterans, men who jumped into Normandy and survived Market Garden, began to question the competence of commanders who'd order such attacks. The newer replacements, who'd been eager for combat just days before, now understood why the veterans had been so quiet, so reluctant to talk about what combat was really like. Combat wasn't glorious. It was walking across a snowfield while machine guns and tank cannons murdered you systematically, and then doing it again the next day because orders were orders. That evening, as medics continued treating the day's casualties and Graves registration personnel prepared body bags for the dead, senior officers held conferences to discuss alternative approaches. The frontal assault doctrine had failed spectacularly. New tactics were needed. Someone suggested simply starving the Germans out, maintain the encirclement, increase the artillery bombardment, wait for hunger and cold and ammunition exhaustion to force a surrender. Someone else proposed a night attack, using darkness to negate German advantages in armor and prepared positions. A third officer advocated for airstrikes. Once the weather cleared, carpet bomb the entire village and eliminate the problem that way. The debate would continue, but one thing was clear. The Americans weren't going to sacrifice more infantry in futile frontal assaults. There had to be a better way. The blood in the snow on December 20th guaranteed that the next attacks would be planned very differently, even if it meant accepting a longer siege and more civilian casualties from artillery. American lives mattered more than Belgian property or German prisoners, and nobody apologized for that calculation. December 21st, 1944. 5 a.m. Inside the turret of Panther Tank No. 234, parked in a barn on the north edge of La Gleize, Oberfeldwebel Hans Gruhl performed a task that would have been unthinkable 4 days earlier. He was siphoning fuel from his own tank to provide mobility for one of the remaining King Tigers. The Panther's fuel gauge read 1/8 full, roughly 40 liters, enough for perhaps 15 kilometers of road movement, less cross-country. The King Tiger they were trying to keep operational had maybe 20 liters, not enough to move more than a few kilometers even on roads. So, Grohl and his crew drained half their remaining fuel, carried it in jerry cans to the King Tiger, and poured it into tanks that would consume it in minutes of combat. It was cannibalization. The desperate practice of destroying your own combat power to maintain a fraction of capability. It meant Gruhl's Panther was now effectively immobile, a static pillbox rather than a mobile weapon. But one mobile King Tiger was worth more than 2 immobile Panthers, at least in theory. The fuel crisis that had concerned Peiper since the beginning of the offensive had now become catastrophic. On December 21st, the Kampfgruppe's fuel status was approximately 500 liters total for all vehicles, less than 10% of what they needed for even basic defensive operations. The Panthers required 150 liters to fill their tanks. The King Tigers needed 800 liters each. Simple mathematics made the situation impossible. There wasn't enough fuel to move more than a handful of vehicles, and those vehicles would run dry within hours. Peiper's operations officer calculated that they had fuel for 1, maybe 2 tactical movements, a single counterattack or a desperate breakout attempt. After that, every tank would be an immobile bunker. The psychological impact on the tank crews was devastating. These men had spent years training on the principle of mobile warfare. Now, they sat in armored coffins waiting for American artillery to find them. The ammunition situation was equally dire, but more varied by type. Machine gun ammunition was relatively plentiful. The infantry could keep fighting for days with their current stocks. Tank main gun ammunition was critical, approximately 40 rounds remaining total for all tank guns combined. That meant 5 to 6 rounds per operational tank, enough for perhaps one serious engagement. Artillery ammunition was completely exhausted. The self-propelled guns and mortars had fired their last rounds on December 20th. Anti-tank rockets for the Panzerfaust were down to double digits, maybe 50 across the entire Kampfgruppe, and there was no resupply coming. The Stavelot Bridge was destroyed. American forces controlled every approach. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. What they had on December 21st was all they would ever have. The food situation transformed proud SS troops into desperate scavengers. The captured American rations they had been living on since December 17th were gone, consumed or destroyed in artillery strikes. German field rations were long since exhausted. Now, soldiers were requisitioning, the military euphemism for stealing, food from Belgian civilians who had almost nothing themselves. A Belgian farmer watched SS troops slaughter his last milk cow, the animal that had kept his family fed through 4 years of occupation. The soldiers butchered it crudely in his barn, taking the meat and leaving him with entrails and a dead investment. Other troops raided civilian food cellars, taking preserved vegetables, canned goods, whatever could be found. Peiper established rationing, 200 grams of food per man per day, roughly 7 ounces. It was starvation rations, barely enough to sustain life, nothing like what combat troops needed. Men became gaunt, hollow-eyed, energy levels dropped, performance degraded. The wounded presented a special crisis that revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of Peiper's command. By December 21st, approximately 300 German soldiers had been wounded badly enough to require medical treatment beyond first aid. They filled the chateau cellar, the church basement, and several reinforced cellars and private homes. Medical supplies were catastrophically inadequate. The battalion surgeon had exhausted his morphine supply on December 19th. Bandages were being reused, blood-soaked dressings cleaned as best as possible, and re-wrapped over wounds. Antibiotics, already scarce in the German army by late 1944, were simply unavailable. Men with penetrating wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment died from infection. Men with shattered limbs that required amputation died from shock and blood loss because the surgeon couldn't perform surgery in a cellar by lantern light with no anesthetic except Belgian wine. The treatment of wounded illustrated the grotesque triage decisions that modern warfare forced on commanders. Lightly wounded men who could still fight were bandaged and sent back to their positions. Seriously wounded men who might survive were given whatever medical care was available. Gravely wounded men who would require extensive resources to save were given morphine when it was still available and left to die. One wounded soldier, a 19-year-old tank driver with both legs crushed, took 4 days to die. His screams echoed through the chateau until another soldier, unable to stand it anymore, held a pillow over his face until he stopped breathing. Mercy killing or murder? The distinction seemed academic when you were living in a charnel house waiting for your own turn to die. The radio communications during this period revealed the psychological disintegration underway in the trapped Kampfgruppe. December 19th, Peiper's transmissions were professional and optimistic. Defensive positions strong, morale excellent, request resupply. December 20th, situation difficult but stable, relief force must accelerate. December 21st, critical shortages all categories, relief essential, immediate, cannot hold much longer. December 22nd, ammunition gone, fuel gone, request permission break out. The tone shifted from confidence to desperation to barely concealed panic. And the responses from division headquarters became vaguer, more evasive. Relief is coming, air resupply being organized, hold your positions. The comfortable lies that commanders tell subordinates they have already written off. Soldiers began writing final letters, the kind you write when you know you're not going home. Some were simple. Dear Mother, I love you. Tell Maria I thought of her at the end. Others were longer, more reflective, men trying to make sense of why they were dying in a Belgian village, for a cause that had clearly lost. A few expressed doubt about the war itself, dangerous thoughts that could get you executed for defeatism if found by a zealous political officer. One soldier wrote to his brother, "We are surrounded. We have no supplies. The relief force isn't coming. Remember me as I was, not as what this war made me." That letter was found on his body when Americans cleared the village. It was eventually sent to his family in 1946. His brother had died on the Eastern Front in 1943. There was nobody left to receive it. The psychological breaking point came at different times for different men. Some veterans, men who'd survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, simply accepted their fate with fatalistic resignation. If death finally caught them in Belgium after dodging it in Russia, so be it. Others, particularly younger soldiers on their first major combat deployment, struggled with cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda and reality. They'd been taught that they were racially superior, that German arms were invincible, that final victory was inevitable, but here they were, trapped, starving, abandoned by their own high command, waiting to die or be captured. The propaganda didn't explain this. The ideology provided no comfort. Some men broke psychologically before they broke physically, staring blankly at walls, no longer responding to orders or questions. Combat fatigue, shell shock, psychological trauma. The terminology varied, but the reality was the same. War breaks men's minds as efficiently as it breaks their bodies. Peiper himself showed remarkable composure under circumstances that would have shattered many commanders. He maintained his command post routine, issuing orders, checking defensive positions, presenting an image of control even as control slipped away. But those close to him noticed changes. The cigarette consumption increased, the sleep decreased, the irritability emerged when staff officers asked questions to which he had no answers. How long until relief arrives? Don't know. When will resupply come? Won't come. What do we do when ammunition runs out? We die or surrender? Those are the options. Peiper never lost his tactical acumen, but the situation had moved beyond tactics. This wasn't a problem that clever maneuver could solve. This was simple arithmetic. Limited supplies divided by daily consumption equals number of days until zero. And zero was approaching fast. By December 22nd, vehicle status told the complete story of degradation. Of 117 armored vehicles that had entered the La Gleize area, 28 were still mobile. 89 sat immobile, scattered across the village and surrounding fields, some destroyed by artillery, most simply out of fuel. The mobile vehicles were concentrated in a last-ditch defensive reserve, positioned to counterattack any American penetration. But counterattack to what end? Even if they stopped an American assault, even if they held La Gleize for another day or week, the outcome was inevitable. They were dying by degrees: hunger, cold, ammunition exhaustion, wounds, and despair. The steel that had seemed so powerful 5 days ago now felt like a prison. Massive armored vehicles transformed into immobile coffins, waiting for American artillery to find them. Starvation in steel. An army that had conquered half of Europe now reduced to desperate men eating slaughtered livestock and writing goodbye letters while waiting for an end that couldn't come quickly enough. December 21st, 1944, 9 a.m. Lieutenant Robert Morrison of the 618th Field Artillery Battalion sat in an observation post on a ridgeline overlooking La Gleize, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the village through the morning haze. His job was simple in theory, complex in execution: identify German positions, calculate firing data, and direct artillery onto targets with enough precision to destroy enemy combat power without wasting ammunition. Morrison had been doing this since Normandy, developing an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and predict where enemy forces would position themselves. Now, studying La Gleize's layout, he saw a target-rich environment: German tanks positioned behind buildings, infantry trenches connecting strong points, the chateau serving as command post, every structure potentially housing enemy troops. He picked up the radio handset and began calling fire missions, his voice calm and professional as he directed death from above. The artillery concentration assembled around La Gleize by December 21st represented one of the most intensive fire support operations of the entire Ardennes campaign. 12 battalions, 4 equipped with 105mm howitzers, 6 with 155mm guns, and 2 with 8-inch heavy artillery, had been assigned to the sector. The 105mm guns fired a 33-pound shell to a maximum range of 11 kilometers. The 155mm guns threw a 95-pound shell 15 kilometers. The 8-inch guns, massive weapons requiring specialized crews, fired 200-pound shells 25 kilometers with devastating effect. Collectively, these batteries could maintain sustained fire of approximately 1,000 rounds per hour for extended periods, more if the tactical situation demanded surge capacity. The Americans were about to demonstrate what industrialized warfare meant: not courage or tactical brilliance, but raw material superiority applied with mathematical precision. The fire missions that Morrison and dozens of other forward observers called in followed a methodical pattern designed to maximize destruction while conserving ammunition. First, registration fires, single rounds or small volleys to confirm the guns were properly ranged on target. Then, systematic coverage of the target area, starting at the edges and working inward, ensuring no position went unengaged. Time on target strikes for critical targets, where all guns fired simultaneously, so their shells arrived at the same instant, giving defenders no warning and no time to take cover. Walking barrages that marched through the village in predetermined patterns. Harassment fires at irregular intervals through the night, denying rest and slowly grinding down morale. It was scientific destruction, warfare reduced to mathematics and industrial capacity. The psychological impact of sustained artillery bombardment cannot be overstated. Soldiers can adapt to almost any combat stress if it's episodic. Attacks come, you fight, the attack ends, you rest. But artillery never ends. Shells fall randomly, unpredictably, without warning. You might survive 100 near misses and die from the 101st. There's no skill involved, no way to fight back. Nothing you can do except shelter in place and hope probability spares you. German soldiers in La Gleize described the experience in letters and post-war interviews with remarkable consistency. The constant noise, the ground shaking, the gradual erosion of rational thought. After 2 days of heavy bombardment, men started making irrational decisions, running into the open during barrages, wandering away from positions, or simply curling up in cellars and refusing to move. Combat effectiveness degraded not through casualties, but through psychological collapse. The targeting priorities revealed American command philosophy. Rather than attempting to kill every German soldier, the artillery focused on destroying combat capability. Tanks were priority targets. Any vehicle that moved drew immediate fire. Buildings housing command posts or observation posts were systematically demolished. Known ammunition storage locations received special attention. The chateau, identified as Peiper's headquarters, was hit so many times that sections of the structure collapsed into the cellar, burying some of the wounded sheltering there. The church, which housed Belgian civilians, was initially spared, but eventually took damage from shells that fell short or from German positions too close to separate. The Americans weren't deliberately targeting civilians, but in an artillery bombardment of this intensity, collateral damage was inevitable and accepted. The night bombardments of December 21st through 22nd were particularly effective because they denied rest to already exhausted German troops. Fire missions started randomly, 20 rounds at 10 p.m., 15 rounds at midnight, 30 rounds at 2 a.m., 10 rounds at 4 a.m. German soldiers couldn't sleep through this. They'd drift off during quiet periods only to be jolted awake by explosions. Sleep deprivation accumulated, reaction times slowed, judgment deteriorated, discipline frayed. The American gunners, working in shifts with hot meals and relief schedules, maintained their tempo indefinitely. The Germans, with no relief and no respite, slowly disintegrated under the unrelenting pressure. It was attritional warfare at its purest. Not dramatic battles, but systematic grinding down of human endurance. The destruction of German armor through artillery represented a significant tactical evolution. Tanks are designed to survive small arms fire and resist frontal penetration from enemy tanks. They're not designed to resist plunging fire from heavy artillery. A 155mm shell landing directly on a Panther's thin top armor would penetrate and destroy the vehicle. Near misses could damage tracks, optics, or external equipment. Repeated impacts, even without penetration, would eventually crack welds, loosen components, and render the vehicle inoperable. By December 22nd, American forward observers had identified and engaged at least 15 German tanks with artillery fire. Direct destruction was confirmed for 5 Panthers and 1 King Tiger. Another 10 vehicles were damaged badly enough that crews abandoned them. The mighty panzers that had seemed invulnerable to American tank guns proved vulnerable to simple high-explosive artillery shells falling from above. The ammunition expenditure was staggering but sustainable, illustrating Allied material superiority. Between December 20th and 23rd, American artillery batteries fired approximately 50,000 shells into the La Gleize pocket. 50,000 rounds. Each shell had to be manufactured, shipped across the Atlantic, transported from ports to forward ammunition depots, distributed to firing batteries, fused, loaded, and fired. The logistics required to sustain this level of fire were extraordinary. Hundreds of trucks, thousands of personnel, a supply chain stretching back to factories in the United States. Germany, by late 1944, could not match this. Their ammunition production was cratering under Allied bombing. Their transportation network was disrupted. Their ability to sustain intensive fire missions had collapsed. The Americans could afford to fire 50,000 shells to eliminate one trapped Kampfgruppe. The Germans couldn't afford to fire 50 shells to support their relief attempts. The effect on La Gleize as a physical place was apocalyptic. Pre-war photographs show a picturesque Belgian village, stone houses with slate roofs, a medieval church with a bell tower, tree-lined streets, tidy farms. Post-bombardment aerial photographs show something closer to the surface of the moon. Buildings collapsed into rubble piles, streets cratered beyond recognition, the church's bell tower shattered, its bells lying in the ruins. Trees stripped of branches, standing like skeletal fingers, reaching toward an indifferent sky. Every structure showed damage. Many had ceased to exist as buildings at all, reduced to scattered stones and splintered timber. The transformation from village to wasteland took less than 72 hours. 50,000 artillery shells will do that. The cost-benefit analysis that American commanders made was cold but rational. An infantry assault to take La Gleize would cost hundreds of American casualties. The December 20th attack had proven that. Artillery bombardment cost 0 American lives while steadily destroying German combat power. Yes, ammunition was expensive. Yes, some shells would be wasted. Yes, Belgian property was being destroyed and Belgian civilians endangered, but American lives were worth more than Belgian property, and an artillery-heavy approach saved American soldiers. The math was brutal but clear. So the bombardment continued, day and night, methodically pulverizing everything inside the German perimeter, until either the Germans surrendered or they were so weakened that infantry could assault with minimal casualties. Lieutenant Morrison, watching through his binoculars as shells impacted the village below, felt no particular emotion about the destruction he was directing. He wasn't sadistic, didn't enjoy killing. He wasn't compassionate, didn't anguish over German suffering. He was professional, doing a job that needed doing. When a building collapsed from repeated hits, he noted it in his log and moved to the next target. When he spotted German infantry attempting to reinforce a position, he called in a fire mission that killed them. When his shift ended, he handed off to the next observer and went to eat a hot meal, while German soldiers below starved in their bunkers. War had become industrial process, and Morrison was a skilled factory worker, producing death with the same efficiency that his father had produced automobiles in a Detroit plant. The bombardment would continue until the product, dead or surrendered Germans, was delivered. Everything else was irrelevant detail. December 19th, 1944. 4 p.m. Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Division, studied the situation map in his command post east of Stavelot and confronted a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His spearhead, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was trapped in La Gleize with no supplies and no way forward. Mohnke's orders from 6th Panzer Army were clear: break through the American lines at Stavelot, relieve Peiper, resume the offensive toward the Meuse. The orders were clear. The execution was impossible. American forces held Stavelot in strength. The roads were narrow. The terrain favored defenders. Every previous relief attempt had been bloodily repulsed, but orders were orders, and Peiper's radio messages were becoming increasingly desperate. Mohnke issued the commands for another attack, knowing it would fail, knowing he was sending men to die for a tactical objective that no longer mattered to the larger battle. But abandoning Peiper without trying seemed unthinkable, so he tried. The 1st SS Panzer Division's first relief attempt on December 19th involved approximately 40 tanks, a mixture of Panthers, Mark IVs, and a few Tigers, supported by 2 battalions of infantry. The plan was straightforward: smash through American positions at Stavelot through sheer weight of armor, establish a corridor to La Gleize, push supplies through, and extract Peiper's force. The attack began at dawn with an artillery barrage that lasted 30 minutes. German guns attempting to suppress American defensive positions. Then the tanks moved forward, grinding through the narrow streets of Stavelot's outskirts, infantry following in half-tracks. For the first hour, the attack made progress. The Germans recaptured several buildings. A Panther destroyed 2 American tank destroyers. Momentum seemed possible. Then the American artillery found them. The 30th Infantry Division's artillery response demonstrated the advantages of prepared defensive positions and superior fire coordination. American forward observers, positioned on high ground with excellent visibility, called in time-on-target strikes that brought dozens of guns to bear simultaneously. Shells began landing among the German vehicles with devastating accuracy. A Mark IV took a direct hit and exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a fireball that engulfed the 2 vehicles behind it. Infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and went to ground, but American machine guns from prepared positions and stone buildings cut them down. The attack stalled within 2 kilometers of its start line, bogged down in the rubble of destroyed buildings and burning vehicles. By noon, the Germans had withdrawn, leaving 18 tanks destroyed or disabled and more than 200 casualties. The relief force had gained nothing. December 20th brought another attempt, this time from a different direction. German commanders reasoned that if Stavelot was too strongly held, perhaps they could flank around it, pushing through Trois Ponts, or finding a crossing point south of American positions. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division attempted to force a crossing of the Amblève at a ford 2 kilometers south of Stavelot. The ford was shallow enough for infantry to wade, but tanks needed a bridge or prepared ford to cross safely. German engineers worked under fire to improve the approaches, laying logs and gravel to create a path the tanks could use. American artillery turned the crossing site into a killing ground. Shells landed in the water, drowning soldiers who'd been knocked unconscious by concussion. They landed on the approaches, destroying trucks bringing forward bridging equipment. They landed on the far bank, killing anyone who had managed to cross. After 4 hours and 80 casualties, the Germans abandoned the attempt. The December 21st push through Stoumont, a village between Stavelot and La Gleize, came closest to success and demonstrated both German tactical skill and the impossibility of their situation. A Kampfgruppe from the 1st SS Panzer Division, reinforced with fresh tanks from division reserves, attacked at dawn following the same template: artillery preparation, armor assault, infantry exploitation. They pushed into Stoumont against fierce American resistance, cleared half the village in brutal house-to-house fighting, and actually reached positions where they could see La Gleize 2 kilometers away. Radio contact was established with Peiper. Relief seemed within reach. Then American counterattacks from both flanks caught the Germans in Stoumont, and the position became untenable. American armor, including tank destroyers armed with 90mm guns that could penetrate Panther armor, engaged from covered positions. German tanks began burning. Infantry was cut off. By evening, the Germans had withdrawn from Stoumont, leaving behind 11 destroyed tanks and approximately 250 casualties. They'd gained 2 kilometers. They'd lost a battalion's worth of combat power, and Peiper remained trapped. The radio communications between Peiper and division headquarters during this period tell a story of promises becoming platitudes, becoming lies. December 19th. Relief force attacking now, hold positions, we will reach you tomorrow. December 20th, relief operations continuing, delay due to strong American resistance. Hold on, we are coming. December 21st, relief force reached Stoumont, continue defensive operations. Supply airdrop being organized. December 22nd, weather conditions prevent air resupply. Relief operations suspended pending strategic reassessment. Continue current mission. December 23rd. Higher headquarters considering options. Maintain defensive posture. The messages got vaguer, less specific, more obviously evasive. Peiper, reading between the lines, understood what wasn't being said. You've been written off. You're on your own. Good luck. The Luftwaffe's complete absence from the relief efforts demonstrated how thoroughly Germany had lost air superiority by December 1944. In theory, airdropped supplies could have sustained Peiper indefinitely. Fuel, ammunition, food, all could have been parachuted into the pocket if Germany still had transport aircraft and fighter cover. But the Luftwaffe was a shell of its former self, destroyed in the grinding battles over Germany throughout 1944. Transport planes were scarce. Fighter aircraft lacked fuel for long-range escort missions. Attempting an airdrop into La Gleize, with American anti-aircraft guns covering the approaches and P-47 Thunderbolts patrolling the skies, would be suicide. So, the airdrop was being organized and weather delayed and eventually just never mentioned again. The absence spoke louder than any official message could. There would be no rescue from the air. The German casualties in the relief attempts were staggering when considered against the lack of results. Approximately 1,200 killed and wounded, 47 tanks destroyed or disabled, dozens of half-tracks and trucks lost, several artillery pieces damaged or captured, all for an advance of perhaps 3 kilometers that was then abandoned. The 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Divisions were elite formations, theoretically among the best troops Germany possessed. They'd been ground down in futile relief attempts while Peiper waited in La Gleize, listening to the sounds of distant combat that grew fainter each day. The strategic absurdity was obvious. Germany was sacrificing forces that might have been used elsewhere, perhaps to stabilize the southern sector of the Ardennes offensive, perhaps to create a mobile reserve, in failed attempts to rescue a force that had already been written off by higher headquarters. The emotional impact on Peiper's trapped soldiers, listening to radio reports of relief attempts, was devastating in a unique way. Hope is torture when you're dying. If you know rescue is impossible, you can accept death or surrender with some equanimity. But if you believe rescue might come tomorrow, you cling to life today even as conditions become unbearable. German soldiers in La Gleize heard the relief force was attacking. They heard it had reached Stoumont. They heard supply drops were coming. Each message renewed hope. Each message proved false. The psychological whipsaw between hope and despair broke men more thoroughly than the artillery bombardment. Some soldiers began to doubt the radio messages entirely, suspecting they were lies or deceptions. Others clung to belief long after all evidence suggested abandonment. The division between those who still hoped and those who'd accepted reality created fractures in unit cohesion at the worst possible time. By December 22nd, even the most optimistic German soldiers in La Gleize understood the truth. No relief force was coming. The attacks had stopped. The radio messages had become meaningless bureaucratic noise. They were surrounded by 4 American divisions with unlimited supplies and total air superiority. They had no fuel, no ammunition, no food, no hope of resupply. Their choice was binary: surrender or die. Peiper, in his command post, began planning a third option: breakout. Not a relief operation where rescuers came to them, but an evacuation where they abandoned everything and fled on foot. It would mean leaving the wounded. It would mean destroying the panzers that had been the pride of the division. It would mean transforming from an armored Kampfgruppe into a ragged column of refugees. But it was the only option that didn't end in death or captivity. The relief that never came had at least clarified Peiper's decision-making. Nobody was going to save them. They had to save themselves, or die trying. December 22nd, 1944, 6 a.m. General James Gavin stood on a ridgeline overlooking La Gleize and watched the preliminary bombardment that would precede the day's coordinated assault. The village below had largely ceased to exist as a coherent settlement, just rubble piles, shattered walls, and smoke rising from fires that had burned for days. But intelligence suggested approximately 2,000 German troops were still defending the ruins, still had operational tanks, still represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. Today's attack would come from 3 directions simultaneously: the 82nd Airborne from the south, the 30th Infantry from the north, and the 3rd Armored Division from the west. The plan was to compress the German perimeter, divide their forces, and force either surrender or complete destruction. It was sound tactics. It was also going to cost American lives, and Gavin hated that calculation even as he accepted its necessity. The preliminary bombardment lasted 2 hours, the most intensive artillery preparation of the entire battle. Every battery within range fired until their tubes glowed red hot and gun crews had to pause to let the weapons cool. The impact area, the German defensive perimeter, was roughly 2 kilometers in diameter. Approximately 4,000 shells fell into that space in 120 minutes. That's 33 shells per minute, 1 shell every 2 seconds, for 2 solid hours. No human construction could survive that. Buildings that had withstood 3 days of intermittent bombardment collapsed under this concentrated punishment. German positions were obliterated. Soldiers who had survived in reinforced cellars died when the cellars became their tombs, buried under tons of collapsing masonry. The bombardment was designed to shock, to stun, to break German resistance before American infantry ever moved forward. The assault from the south, led by elements of the 504th and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiments, began at 8 a.m. This time, there would be no walking across open ground into German guns. The paratroopers moved in small teams using whatever cover the devastated terrain offered: rubble piles, shell craters, the ruins of destroyed buildings. Engineers had marked suspected minefield locations. Tank destroyers provided overwatch, ready to engage any German armor that appeared. The advance was methodical, almost cautious, very different from the suicidal assault 2 days earlier. The Americans had learned. Casualties were acceptable only if they produced results. Frontal charges were replaced with fire and maneuver, with artillery support called in whenever resistance was encountered. Progress was measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers per day, but it was steady progress with far fewer casualties. The fighting in the ruins of La Gleize was intimate and vicious in ways that open field combat never was. Visibility was limited to a few meters. Every pile of rubble might conceal a German position. Every cellar entrance might be booby-trapped. The paratroopers used grenades liberally, tossing them into any space that might hold enemy troops, then waiting for the explosion before moving forward. German defenders, weakened by days of bombardment and supply shortages, still fought with professional competence. Machine gun positions covered approaches. Snipers picked off Americans who exposed themselves. Small counterattacks tried to reclaim lost positions, but the Germans were fighting with diminishing resources against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and replacements. Slowly, inexorably, the American line pushed forward. The tank battle on La Gleize's western edge demonstrated what American numerical superiority meant in practical terms. The 3rd Armored Division brought forward approximately 30 Sherman tanks to support the infantry assault. The Germans could muster 13 operational tanks, 8 Panthers, 3 Mark IVs, and 2 King Tigers. In a straight fight, the German tanks were superior. Panther guns could kill Shermans at range. King Tiger armor was nearly invulnerable to Sherman fire from the front, but tactics and numbers overcame quality. American tanks maneuvered in platoons, using one tank to draw German fire while others flanked for side shots. When a Panther engaged one Sherman, 2 more would appear from different angles. The German tank might kill 1 or even 2 Shermans before the 3rd got a flanking shot that penetrated thinner side armor. It was expensive. The 3rd Armored lost 7 Shermans in 2 hours, but it worked. By mid-morning, German tanks were burning, and the others had withdrawn deeper into the perimeter. The capture of the chateau around noon on December 22nd was a turning point, both tactical and humanitarian. The chateau had served as Peiper's command post and the main German field hospital. When American paratroopers finally fought their way into the building, using satchel charges to blow doors, clearing rooms with grenades and rifle fire, they found a scene of horror. 120 wounded German soldiers packed into the wine cellars. Some had been wounded 5 days earlier and received nothing but basic bandaging. Wounds were infected, gangrenous, festering. The smell was overwhelming: blood, excrement, rot, despair. A few German medics were still trying to provide care with no supplies and no hope. The Americans called for their own medics and began the grim work of triage. Some German wounded were beyond saving, given morphine and made comfortable. Others were stabilized and evacuated to American aid stations. The chateau's capture meant Peiper had lost his command post and his hospital. The German defensive perimeter had been cut in half. The use of flamethrowers in the urban fighting generated controversy even at the time. Flamethrowers were devastating against German positions in stone buildings, Streams of burning fuel would flow through the windows and doors, incinerating anyone inside or forcing them to flee into American guns. But the weapon was indiscriminate. Buildings that might have sheltered Belgian civilians as well as German soldiers received the same treatment. American commanders justified the use as necessary to reduce American casualties. A flamethrower team could clear a building in minutes that might otherwise require hours of dangerous room-to-room fighting. But the aftermath was gruesome. Burned bodies, both German soldiers, and occasionally Belgian civilians who'd been trapped in the buildings. Survivors with burns over most of their bodies, dying in agony. The flamethrower teams, typically young soldiers who had been selected for the job because they had strong stomachs, would need psychiatric treatment after the war. Some never recovered from what they had been ordered to do. By late afternoon on December 22nd, the German defensive perimeter had contracted to a circle roughly 200 meters in diameter around the village church. Peiper's remaining forces, estimates ranged from 800 to 1,000 effectives, the uncertainty reflecting the chaos, held a position that couldn't be sustained. They had perhaps a dozen operational fighting vehicles. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The wounded were in desperate condition. American forces surrounded them completely, and the ring was tightening with every passing hour. Some German soldiers were surrendering individually or in small groups, hands raised, walking toward American lines with the exhausted relief of men who'd survived longer than they had any right to expect. Others continued fighting, whether from loyalty, ideology, or simply the momentum of having fought this long. Peiper, observing from a basement that now served as his command post after the chateau was lost, understood that the end was approaching. The question was whether that end would be honorable surrender, complete annihilation, or something else. The American tactical success on December 22nd demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms warfare when properly executed. Artillery had prepared the battlefield. Infantry advanced using fire and maneuver. Armor provided mobile firepower and shock action. Engineers cleared obstacles and marked minefields. The different elements supported each other, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. It was textbook operations, the kind taught at military schools, finally implemented effectively in actual combat. The cost had been significant. The Americans lost approximately 140 casualties on December 22nd, plus the 7 tanks, but it was far lower than the December 20th assault. The lesson was clear. Patience and preparation reduced casualties. Hasty attacks fed the meat grinder. The tightening ring would continue to close, methodically and inexorably, until the trapped Germans were eliminated or surrendered. As darkness fell on December 22nd, American troops consolidated their gains and prepared for another day of grinding combat. German troops in the contracted perimeter tried to rest, knowing tomorrow would likely bring the final assault. And in his basement command post, Joachim Peiper made the decision he had been postponing for days. Tomorrow night, December 23rd into 24th, they would attempt a breakout, abandon the vehicles, abandon the heavy weapons, abandon the wounded who couldn't walk, move on foot through American lines under cover of darkness, trying to reach German positions 15 kilometers to the east. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success. It was also the only plan that offered even the possibility of survival. Peiper began issuing orders for the evacuation, carefully coded in case American signals intelligence was listening. The relief that never came had forced him to rely on the oldest military tactic: run away and hope you live long enough to fight another day. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve morning. Andrei Kaiser-Baraki, 17 years old, emerged from the church cellar where he'd sheltered for 5 days and stepped into a landscape he couldn't comprehend. This was La Gleize, the village where he had lived his entire life, where he knew every street and every building and every family, except none of it existed anymore. The bakery where his mother bought bread, gone, just a pile of shattered brick. The school where he'd learned to read, collapsed, the roof caved in. His own family's farmhouse, he could see it in the distance, or what remained of it, walls standing but roof destroyed, barn flattened. He stood in the church square, slowly turning in a circle, trying to recognize landmarks that weren't there anymore. The village hadn't been damaged, it had been erased. Andrei sat down on a piece of rubble and cried, not for the dead, though there were plenty of those, but for the simple, irretrievable loss of home. The damage assessment conducted by American combat engineers on December 24th provided statistical substance to André's emotional reaction. Of approximately 150 buildings in La Gleize proper, 127 showed visible damage. 63 were complete losses, collapsed, burned, or so structurally compromised they would need to be demolished. 48 were seriously damaged, missing roofs, walls breached, requiring extensive reconstruction. 16 were moderately damaged, intact structures, but with significant shell damage, broken windows, interior destruction. Only 23 buildings escaped, with minor or no damage, mostly structures on the extreme edges of the village that had been outside the main combat zone. The village church, despite housing civilians throughout the battle, had sustained major damage. The bell tower partially collapsed, the roof riddled with shrapnel holes, the stained glass windows completely destroyed. The structure remained standing, but barely. The infrastructure damage extended beyond buildings. Every road in the village was cratered by artillery, some sections destroyed so thoroughly that determining the original road path required reference to pre-war maps. The water system, a network of underground pipes feeding from a central well, was broken in dozens of places, probably by ground shock from artillery impacts. Electric power lines, which had been knocked out early in the battle, were now completely destroyed, poles shattered and wires tangled in rubble. The bridge approaches on roads leading in and out of the village had been demolished by engineers on both sides, making vehicle access impossible until repairs were made. From a civil engineering perspective, La Gleize had ceased to function as a village. It was a disaster zone requiring complete reconstruction before anyone could live there again. The agricultural devastation hit the farming families hardest because it destroyed their livelihoods and futures. The Kaiser Baraki family farm, typical of the area, had maintained 18 dairy cows, the foundation of their economic survival. 16 of those cows were dead, killed by artillery, shot by scavenging soldiers, or dead from neglect because nobody could tend them during the battle. The 2 survivors were in poor condition, probably not salvageable. The fields that would have been planted in spring, 1945, were now contaminated with unexploded ordnance, American and German shells that had failed to detonate, grenades, mines. Those fields couldn't be worked until they were cleared, and ordnance disposal might take years. The Kaiser Baraki's plow was destroyed, crushed under a collapsed barn. Their wagon was burned. Their tools were looted or scattered. Even if they wanted to resume farming, they lacked the basic equipment to do so. The human cost statistics tell part of the story, but miss the emotional weight. 27 Belgian civilians killed during the 6-day battle. The names and ages and causes of death were recorded. Madame Gregoire, 53, killed by artillery shrapnel, December 21st. Monsieur Bertrand, 67, killed by rifle fire. December 22nd, probably shot accidentally by a German soldier firing at American positions. Little Catherine Hanlett, 4 years old, killed December 23rd when the building she was sheltering in took a direct hit from a 155mm shell. 27 names, 27 families destroyed or damaged beyond repair, 27 futures erased, and the 60 wounded, some with injuries that would heal, others maimed permanently, all traumatized in ways that 1944 psychology barely acknowledged and certainly couldn't treat. The discovery of atrocity evidence added moral weight to the physical destruction. As American troops cleared the village, they found Belgian civilian bodies showing signs of execution-style killings rather than combat casualties. 1 man shot in the back of the head. 2 elderly women with their throats cut. These weren't artillery victims. These were murders, probably committed by German soldiers who'd killed witnesses to war crimes, or who'd simply cracked under the stress and killed randomly. The Americans documented everything, photographed the bodies, took statements from Belgian survivors who'd witnessed the killings. War crimes investigation teams would arrive later, adding law. Gleize to the growing list of atrocities committed by Peiper's Kampfgruppe. For the Belgian survivors, the distinction between killed in combat and murdered was academic. Dead was dead. But for the historical record, those bodies represented evidence that would send men to trial years later. The Belgian civilian reaction to liberation mixed relief with rage in complicated ways that American soldiers found difficult to understand. Some civilians greeted the Americans as genuine liberators, crying and thanking them for ending the nightmare. Others were sullen, angry, asking why the Americans had destroyed their village to eliminate Germans who were already trapped and defeated. American commanders tried to explain the tactical necessities, better to destroy buildings than sacrifice American lives. The Belgian response was often, easy to say when it's not your home being destroyed. These tensions never erupted into real conflict, but they soured relationships. Some American soldiers, expecting gratitude, instead received complaints. Some Belgian civilians, expecting sympathy, instead received bureaucratic indifference. The Americans would move on to the next battle. The Belgians would remain in the ruins, trying to rebuild lives from nothing. The economic calculation of rebuilding La Gleize was staggering for a rural community. Pre-war, the village's annual economic output, mostly agricultural products and small-scale trade, was approximately 350,000 Belgian francs. The damage assessment estimated reconstruction costs at 14 million francs, roughly 40 years of the village's total economic production. Individual families faced similar math. The Kaiser Baraki family's farm represented 3 generations of accumulated capital, land, buildings, equipment, livestock, all destroyed in 6 days. Rebuilding would require resources they didn't have and probably couldn't borrow. Many families would choose to leave, abandoning La Gleize for cities where they could find work. The village's population, which had been 450 before the war, would drop to fewer than 300 by 1950. Physical reconstruction could happen with sufficient money and labor. Psychological and economic recovery would take decades. The preservation of physical evidence occurred almost by accident. American military photographers documented the destruction for intelligence purposes, creating a comprehensive visual record of what artillery bombardment could accomplish. Unexploded ordnance scattered throughout the village, and surrounding fields couldn't be removed immediately, so the area was declared hazardous and access restricted. This accidental preservation meant that when historians and memorial planners arrived years later, they found a battlefield largely unchanged since December 1944. The King Tiger tank that broke down on the village edge during Peiper's retreat, too heavy to tow, too dangerous to demolish, simply stayed where it stopped. Eventually, locals realized that the tank, the ruins, the preserved battlefield represented something valuable: memory. The physical destruction of La Gleize, left partially unreconstructed, became a memorial to the battle and a testament to the destructive capacity of modern war. December 24, 1944, in the afternoon. André Kaiser Baraki walked through the ruins, trying to find salvageable possessions from his family's destroyed home. He found a photograph album, water-damaged but partially intact, pictures of his grandparents and parents from before the war. He found his school books, scattered in the rubble, their pages dirty but readable. He found his father's pocket watch, stopped at 2:14, the time when the shell hit their house. These small objects, worthless to anyone else, represented continuity with a world that no longer existed. André packed them carefully, knowing they were all he'd have to remember home. Around him, other families were doing the same, salvaging fragments of their previous lives from the wreckage. The village of La Gleize, as a physical place, had been erased, but the village as memory, as identity, as home, would survive in these salvaged fragments and in the stories told by those who had endured 6 days of hell and somehow lived to speak of it. December 23, 1944, 9 p.m. In a cellar beneath what had once been a bakery in La Gleize, Joachim Peiper addressed his surviving officers for the final time. Approximately 30 men crowded into the cramped space, lit by a single oil lamp that cast grotesque shadows on the walls. Peiper's face was gaunt, hollow-eyed from 5 days without adequate sleep or food, but his voice remained steady as he outlined the plan. They would abandon the vehicles. They would destroy everything that couldn't be carried. They would move on foot, in single file, crossing the Amblève River at a ford 2 kilometers north of their current position. The march would cover approximately 15 kilometers through American-held territory to reach German lines at Wani. Only soldiers capable of forced march would go. No vehicles, no heavy weapons, no wounded who couldn't walk. The officers received their instructions in silence. Nobody questioned the orders. Nobody asked about the men being left behind. They all understood this was their last chance. After tonight, it would be death or surrender. Peiper finished his briefing with words he'd remember for the rest of his life. Only the unwounded. We march tonight. Silence absolute. Good luck. The systematic destruction of German equipment began at 10 p.m., a process that felt like murder to the tank crews who had lived in their vehicles for months. The Panthers, the King Tigers, the Mark IVs. Each tank was disabled according to procedure. Grenades placed in the main gun breeches to destroy the firing mechanisms. Thermite grenades dropped into engine. Compartments to melt critical components. In some cases, the crews simply set fire to their vehicles, watching as flames consumed the steel coffins that had protected them. Oberfeldwebel Hans Grühle stood beside his Panther, the tank he had commanded since Normandy, and placed the charges himself. The explosion when he detonated them was small, just enough to wreck the gun, but it felt like an explosion in his chest, his tank, his home, his identity as a Panzer crewman, all destroyed by his own hand. The Americans would find operational guns and intact vehicles. German high command had been explicit: deny the enemy everything. So, they destroyed their own weapons and felt the deaths of their combat identities as keenly as the deaths of comrades. The wounded presented the breakout's most agonizing moral dimension, the decision that would define how history judged Peiper. Approximately 320 German soldiers were wounded badly enough that they couldn't walk 15 kilometers through frozen terrain. These men were doomed if left behind. Either they'd die from their wounds in the next few days, or they'd become American prisoners. Peiper made the calculated decision: leave them. Provide them with what medical supplies remained. Leave a note for the Americans requesting medical treatment for wounded prisoners. But abandon them, because bringing them meant slowing the entire column and ensuring nobody escaped. The wounded who understood what was happening reacted in different ways. Some accepted it with fatalistic resignation. This was war. This was survival. No hard feelings. Others begged not to be left, promising they could walk. They'd keep up. Just don't leave them for the Americans. The worst were those too badly wounded to understand. Men who smiled and wished their comrades good luck, not realizing they were being abandoned to die or face captivity. The column that assembled in the darkness just before midnight included approximately 770 men, all that remained of the 4,800 who'd entered the La Gleize area 6 days earlier. They carried rifles, machine guns, personal weapons, and almost nothing else. No heavy equipment, no radios beyond short-range sets, minimal food. They had marched on whatever energy remained in bodies that had been starving for 3 days. The formation was simple: single file, 5-meter spacing between soldiers, absolute silence. Peiper and his command group would lead. Combat-effective troops in the middle, the walking wounded at the rear. If anyone fell behind, they'd be left. The column couldn't stop. If anyone made noise, they'd be killed by their own men. American listening posts would hear, and the entire breakout would fail. The men understood. They'd been SS troops long enough to know that survival meant brutality, sometimes even toward your own. The midnight crossing of the Amblève River tested men who'd already been tested beyond endurance. The ford was marked by German scouts who'd reconnoitered earlier, a section of river roughly 40 meters wide where the water was chest deep for average height men. In December, with the temperature at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the water was so cold it felt like knives stabbing every inch of submerged skin. Peiper went first, wading into the darkness, feeling the current pushing against him. The riverbed was rocky, treacherous, easy to lose your footing. Men held their weapons above their heads to keep them dry. Some men fell, went under, struggled back up gasping. One man, weakened by days of hunger, simply disappeared, swept downstream in the darkness, probably drowned before anyone could help. The column kept moving. 770 men crossing one at a time, each man disappearing into the black water and emerging on the far bank half frozen and stumbling with hypothermia. The march through American-held territory required a combination of stealth, luck, and the fog of war that made the American perimeter porous despite overwhelming numerical superiority. Peiper's route threaded between American positions, following forest trails and minor roads that weren't continuously monitored. The Germans moved in almost perfect silence, 700 men placing each footstep carefully, breathing shallowly, weapons carried loosely to prevent metallic sounds. Twice they passed within 100 meters of American outposts without being detected. Once they heard American voices, guards talking, cigarettes glowing in the dark, and the entire column froze for 15 minutes until the guards moved away. The tension was unbearable. One cough, one dropped weapon, one moment of carelessness, and American machine guns would open fire, and the entire column would be annihilated. The discovery of the empty German positions at dawn on December 24th shocked American forces, who'd expected to launch another assault that morning. Forward scouts moving cautiously into La Gleize found abandoned fighting positions, destroyed vehicles still smoldering, and the wounded in the chateau cellars. The realization that Peiper had escaped triggered immediate response. Patrols sent out to track the German column, artillery fire called on suspected escape routes, roadblocks established on roads leading east. But the response came hours too late. Peiper's force had already covered half the distance to German lines. American commanders were furious. A trapped enemy had escaped through a supposedly tight encirclement. Questions would be asked about whose sector had failed to maintain adequate observation, but the reality was simpler. It's almost impossible to seal a perimeter completely at night when the enemy is desperate, and your own forces are exhausted from days of combat. The casualties during the breakout march came not from combat, but from exposure and exhaustion. Men collapsed from hypothermia, their wet clothing freezing in the sub-zero temperatures. Some collapsed from sheer physical depletion, bodies that had marched 15 kilometers after days of starvation and combat stress. Peiper's orders were clear: no stops, no rescues. Men who fell were left where they lay. Some died there in the darkness. Some were captured by American patrols the following day. Some managed to drag themselves to German lines hours or days later. The exact number of casualties during the march was never firmly established. Estimates range from 82 to over 100. What's certain is that only approximately 690 men from the original column reached German lines intact. Almost 100 men made it out of La Gleize, only to die in the forest between there and safety, killed by the cold and their own exhausted bodies. The arrival at German positions at Wannay around 6 a.m. on December 24th should have been triumphant. Survivors returning from behind enemy lines, a miraculous escape. Instead, it was pathetic. Peiper's men stumbled into German positions looking more like refugees than elite troops, hollow-eyed, gaunt, uniforms frozen stiff with ice. Some men were literally dragging others who couldn't walk. German soldiers from units that hadn't been in the pocket stared in shock at these apparitions. This was the 1st des Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's elite bodyguard formation. These scarecrows who could barely stand. Peiper reported to division headquarters, delivered a formal briefing on the operation, missions accomplished, obstacles encountered, current status, and then collapsed. He'd been awake for nearly 70 hours. He'd led his men through hell and gotten a fraction of them out alive. And for what? The Ardennes offensive had failed. The war was lost. Everything they'd endured had been for nothing. The equipment accounting told the story of defeat in cold numbers. 117 tanks and armored vehicles that had entered La Gleize area, 0 vehicles extracted, 28 tanks destroyed by artillery or captured intact, 89 vehicles abandoned and destroyed by their own crews, all heavy weapons destroyed or abandoned, all supplies exhausted. Of the original 4,800 men, approximately 690 reached German lines, 250 killed in action, 1,600 wounded and left behind or captured, 850 missing, evacuated wounded who'd died in American aid stations, men who'd fallen during the march, those who had surrendered individually rather than attempt the breakout. The Kampfgruppe that was supposed to spearhead Germany's last great offensive had been effectively destroyed. It would be reformed on paper, brought up to strength with replacements, but the core of experienced veterans was gone, scattered as casualties across the Belgian snow. December 24th, Christmas Eve Day. American troops secured La Gleize completely, rounded up the German wounded for evacuation to PO hospitals, and began the process of accounting for captured equipment. The intelligence officers who cataloged the abandoned German vehicles were astounded by the quality and quantity. 6 King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world, 22 Panthers, formidable weapons that outgunned any American tank, dozens of half-tracks and trucks, all intact or easily repairable. It was the largest single collection of captured German armor from the entire war. Technical intelligence teams would spend weeks examining the vehicles, measuring armor thickness, studying engineering solutions, photographing every detail. For the Americans, the abandoned German equipment at La Gleize was an intelligence windfall. For the Germans, it was a monument to defeat. Joachim Peiper had driven farther than any other German commander in the Ardennes offensive, and all he had to show for it was a handful of exhausted survivors and the wreckage of the most powerful armored force Germany had assembled in the West. December 24, 1944, 7 a.m. Captain William Fayette, commanding officer of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment's medical detachment, descended into the chateau cellar in La Gleize and confronted a scene that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. 320 wounded German soldiers packed into a space designed as a wine cellar. The smell of infected wounds, gangrene, excrement, and death was overwhelming. Some wounded were conscious, staring at the Americans with expressions of terror, or relief, or blank incomprehension. Others were unconscious or delirious. A few were clearly dead, bodies that nobody had moved because there was nowhere to move them to. The German medics who had stayed with the wounded looked at Fayette with exhausted desperation, and one asked in halting English, "Please help them. They are soldiers, same as yours." Fayette called for his entire medical unit and every ambulance that could be spared. This wasn't combat anymore. This was triage and mercy. The examination of wounded German soldiers revealed the inadequacy of German medical support and the cost of the encirclement. Many men had wounds that were 5 or 6 days old, injuries sustained on December 18th or 19th that had received nothing beyond basic field dressings. Shrapnel wounds that could have been sutured had instead been left open, now infected. Broken bones that could have been set were left untreated, now impossible to fix properly. Abdominal injuries that required surgery had festered. American medics worked through Christmas Eve providing care that German doctors couldn't, but for many, it was too late. Of the 320 wounded Germans left in La Gleize, 89 would die within the next week despite American medical treatment. The wounds were too severe, infection too advanced, their bodies too weakened by days without proper nutrition. The Americans did what they could. It wasn't enough. The treatment of German POZ by American forces was professional and generally humane, but that didn't prevent the awkward reckoning when identities and unit histories were established. As American intelligence officers interviewed captured Germans, questions about unit designation came up routinely. 1st S Panzer Division, the interviewers knew that name. The unit had been identified at Malmedy, 84 American prisoners massacred. The interviewing officer's tone changed. "Where were you on December 17th? What route did your column take? Did you witness any incidents involving American prisoners?" The German soldiers responded with varying degrees of honesty. Some genuinely hadn't been present at atrocities. Some claimed ignorance that nobody believed. A few, broken by captivity or conscience, confessed to witnessing executions. The Americans documented everything, building case files that would eventually lead to war crimes trials. The discovery of Belgian civilian bodies showing execution-style wounds added civilian victims to the accounting of Peiper's crimes. American investigators, working with Belgian authorities, exhumed bodies and conducted autopsies. Some civilians had died from artillery or combat crossfire. These were tragic but not criminal. Others had died from gunshot wounds to the head at close range, or had their throats cut, or showed signs of torture. These were murders, not combat casualties. Belgian witnesses provided testimony about German soldiers killing civilians who'd complained about requisitions, or who'd been suspected of signaling to Americans, or who'd simply been in the wrong place when German soldiers lost control. 13 verified civilian executions were documented in the La Gleize area, December 18th through 23rd. Added to the Malmedy massacre and the killings at Stavelot and other locations, the evidence of systematic war crimes became overwhelming. Major Hal McCown provided critical testimony, linking Peiper directly to criminal knowledge, if not criminal orders. McCown, a battalion commander from the 30th Infantry Division, had been captured by Peiper's forces on December 21st during a skirmish near La Gleize. He'd spent 2 days as a prisoner in German custody before being released during the breakout. Peiper had told him to stay in the chateau with the wounded rather than attempt the march. McCown's testimony to American investigators was damning. Peiper knew about the Malmedy massacre, had discussed it with McCown, had neither expressed regret nor claimed ignorance. Peiper had defended the killings as military necessity, arguing that taking prisoners would have slowed his advance. McCown's testimony as a field-grade officer with no reason to fabricate provided credible evidence that would be central to the eventual war crimes prosecution. The burned American vehicles discovered near Stavelot provided physical evidence of additional atrocities. Several M4 Sherman tanks and trucks showed signs of being deliberately burned with crews inside. The burn patterns suggested accelerants had been used, not combat damage, but intentional destruction. Bodies recovered from the vehicles showed they'd been killed before the fires, probably shot at close range. The scenario reconstructed by investigators. American crews disabled or surrendered, then executed, then their vehicles burned to hide the evidence. This matched testimony from Belgian civilians who'd witnessed German soldiers shooting American prisoners, then destroying their vehicles. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, more war crimes to add to the growing list. The legal framework for prosecuting these crimes was unprecedented in December 1944, but would become routine in the post-war period. The Geneva Conventions established rules for treatment of prisoners and civilians, but enforcement mechanisms were weak. War crimes trials had been conducted before. After World War I, the Germans had conducted limited trials of their own officers accused of atrocities. But the scale contemplated for post-World War II prosecutions was unprecedented. Systematic trials of thousands of perpetrators for crimes ranging from genocide to individual murders. The evidence being gathered at La Gleize and dozens of other sites would feed into this machinery of justice. Every photograph, every testimony, every autopsy report became part of case files that would eventually land on prosecutors' desks at Nuremberg and smaller trials. The Malmedy trial in 1946 would bring 74 defendants, mostly members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, before an American military tribunal at Dachau. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, eyewitness testimony from survivors, forensic evidence from the massacre site, testimony from Belgian civilians about other killings, and captured German documents discussing prisoner handling. Peiper himself was charged as commanding officer. If he didn't order the killings, he at least failed to prevent them and failed to punish perpetrators. The tribunal heard 3 months of testimony. The verdict: 43 defendants sentenced to death, including Peiper, 22 sentenced to life imprisonment, 8 sentenced to shorter terms, 1 acquitted. Justice of a sort had been served, but justice in war crimes cases is complicated by political considerations and the passage of time. Peiper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1948. After appeals and review, he was released in 1956, having served only 11 years. Some saw this as appropriate. A commander who hadn't directly ordered atrocities shouldn't be executed. Others saw it as a failure of justice, a war criminal escaping appropriate punishment through legal maneuvering. Peiper moved to France after his release, worked in the auto industry, tried to live a quiet life, but the past followed him. In 1976, on Bastille Day, his house in France was firebombed. Peiper died in the fire. The perpetrators were never identified, though theories ranged from communist activists to French resistance veterans to concentration camp survivors. Justice delayed had become justice delivered by vigilantes. The long-term psychological impact on survivors, American, German, and Belgian, manifested in ways that 1940s medicine didn't understand or treat. American soldiers who had fought at La Gleize reported nightmares for years afterward. The flamethrower teams, in particular, struggled with what they'd done, even though they'd followed orders. German survivors carried guilt about abandoned wounded and destroyed equipment. Belgian civilians carried trauma from 6 days of terror and loss of homes. Modern psychiatry would diagnose PTSD across the board. In 1945, it was just called nervousness or difficulty adjusting, and people were expected to get over it. Most didn't. They buried it, lived with it, passed trauma to children through tension and silence. The Battle of La Gleize claimed more victims than the casualty lists showed. December 24th, 1944, evening. As American troops celebrated a subdued Christmas Eve in the ruins of La Gleize, Captain Fayette worked in a field hospital treating German wounded who'd been evacuated from the village. One young German soldier, 19 years old, dying from an abdominal wound that had gone septic, asked Fayette, "Why do you help me? I am your enemy." Fayette, who'd lost friends in the fighting, who'd seen the evidence of massacres, who had every reason to hate German soldiers, replied, "Because that's what we do. That's what makes us different." The German soldier died 2 hours later. Fayette would tell that story for the rest of his life, never quite articulating what lesson he wanted people to draw from it. War creates victims and criminals, sometimes in the same person. Justice requires accounting for crimes while still maintaining humanity. The reckoning at La Gleize was legal, moral, and personal. And decades later, historians would still debate whether justice was truly served or merely performed for an audience that needed to believe good had triumphed over evil in ways more clear-cut than reality ever allows. December 24th, 1944, 10 a.m. Christmas Eve morning, Private First Class Robert Hayes of the 82nd Airborne walked through the ruins of La Gleize, carrying a case of sea rations and looking for Belgian civilians to feed. He'd been fighting for 6 days straight, sleeping in frozen foxholes, watching friends die, killing Germans he never saw clearly through the smoke and snow. Now the fighting was over, the Germans were gone, and Hayes found himself doing something he'd never expected, playing Santa Claus in a destroyed Belgian village. He found the first family in what remained of a cellar, mother, father, 3 children, all staring at him with hollow eyes. Hayes opened the ration case and started handing out tins of meat and crackers. The youngest child, maybe 5 years old, took the tin and just held it, not opening it, not eating, just staring at this food that had appeared from nowhere. The mother started crying. Hayes, who'd thought he was beyond emotion after what he'd seen, found his own eyes watering. This was victory. This was liberation. It looked nothing like the newsreels. The immediate aftermath of discovering Peiper's escape was chaos mixed with relief, mixed with fury. American commanders were furious that a trapped enemy force had slipped through their lines. How had 700 men crossed a supposedly sealed perimeter? Which unit had failed to maintain adequate observation? The finger-pointing started immediately and would continue for weeks in after-action reports. But the enlisted men felt differently. They were relieved. No more assault. No more walking into German guns. No more watching friends die for a village that wasn't even American. The Germans were gone. The battle was over. They'd survived. That was enough. The tactical embarrassment of letting Peiper escape mattered to colonels and generals. For the privates and sergeants who'd done the actual fighting, victory meant they were still breathing on Christmas Eve. The discovery of abandoned German equipment transformed La Gleize from battlefield to intelligence goldmine. Technical intelligence officers arrived within hours of the village's capture, bringing cameras, measuring tools, and orders to document everything. The King Tigers were particular prizes. Only a handful had been captured intact during the entire war. American engineers measured armor thickness, studied the transmission design, examined the 88mm gun's breech mechanism. They photographed every detail from dozens of angles. They collected shell casings to analyze German ammunition. The Panthers received similar scrutiny. One intelligence officer commented that Peiper had inadvertently given the Americans a technical exhibition worth more than a successful defense. The Germans had destroyed their vehicle's combat capability, but they'd left the hardware intact for American study. Every captured tank represented thousands of engineering hours that Allied designers could learn from. The cataloging of captured equipment took days and revealed the scale of German losses. Final count: 6 King Tiger tanks, 22 Panther tanks, 7 Mark IV tanks, 73 half-tracks and armored personnel carriers, 32 trucks, 5 self-propelled guns, 18 motorcycles, and miscellaneous equipment, including machine guns, rifles, and personal gear. The total value, calculated at German replacement cost, was approximately 18 million Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to 150 American Sherman tanks. Peiper had lost the equivalent of an entire armored regiment's worth of equipment. The King Tigers alone represented irreplaceable losses. Germany's production capacity was so degraded by December 1944 that those 6 tanks probably couldn't be replaced at all. The Americans were cataloging not just German equipment, but German industrial capacity destroyed. The strategic assessment conducted by 1st Army Headquarters on December 25th put La Gleize in context of the larger Ardennes offensive. Peiper's Kampfgruppe had consumed 6 critical days of the German timetable. The offensive had been planned on a strict schedule, reached the Meuse by December 20th, Antwerp by December 25th. Peiper's entrapment and the American response had absorbed 4 divisions, thousands of tons of ammunition, and critical time during which other German forces were supposed to exploit his breakthrough. Instead, those forces had exhausted themselves in failed relief attempts. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to be the main effort, had effectively been neutralized. By Christmas Day, the German offensive was clearly failing. American reinforcements were pouring into the Ardennes. The weather was clearing, allowing Allied air power to devastate German columns. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and La Gleize was a significant part of that failure. The American casualty accounting for the La Gleize operation provided the butcher's bill that justified the victory. Approximately 780 American soldiers killed, wounded, or missing during the 7-day battle, December 18th through 24th. The 82nd Airborne took the heaviest losses, roughly 450 casualties. The 30th Infantry Division lost approximately 250 fighting for Stavelot and in supporting attacks. The 3rd Armored Division and other units accounted for the remainder. These weren't catastrophic losses by World War II standards. Some single-day battles in the Pacific had killed more Americans, but they represented real people, real families that would receive telegrams, real communities that would mourn. 780 Americans who had been alive on December 17th were dead or wounded by Christmas. The price of stopping Peiper, the cost of victory. German casualties were substantially higher and included categories that American forces didn't face. Approximately 800 killed in action during the battle and relief attempts. 1,600 wounded, most captured when Peiper abandoned them. 750 wounded evacuated during the breakout, many of whom died in the following weeks from inadequate medical care. 850 missing. This category included men who had died during the march to German lines, who'd surrendered individually, who'd simply disappeared in the chaos. Total casualties, approximately 4,000. Of the 4,800 men who'd entered the La Gleize area, only 800 remained effective combatants. By December 25th, the Kampfgruppe had been destroyed as a fighting force. It would be reconstituted on paper, filled with replacements, but the core of veterans was gone. The propaganda value of La Gleize was immediately recognized by Allied public relations officers. Here was a clear American victory in an offensive that had initially appeared catastrophic. German supermen in their invincible tanks, trapped and defeated by American determination and firepower. The story was too good not to exploit. Correspondents were brought to La Gleize on December 26th to photograph the captured equipment and interview soldiers. The resulting stories in American newspapers portrayed La Gleize as a turning point where American forces had smashed the Nazi spearhead. The reality was more complex. The German offensive had stalled for many reasons, La Gleize being just one. But complexity doesn't sell newspapers or boost morale. The American public got a simplified story. Brave paratroopers stop elite SS, capture impressive German tanks, liberate grateful Belgians. It was true enough, and it served its purpose. The treatment of German POWs from La Gleize followed standard procedures but occurred in an atmosphere of tension, given the Malmedy massacre revelations. American guards had seen the bodies at Malmedy. They had heard the survivor testimony. They knew the unit they were guarding had committed atrocities. Most guards remained professional, but there were incidents. A few POWs were beaten during interrogation. Food rations for German prisoners were minimal, barely adequate. Medical care was provided, but wounded German soldiers were triaged last, after American and Belgian casualties. It wasn't systematic abuse, but it wasn't the full Geneva Convention treatment either. American commanders looked the other way. After Malmedy, after the casualties at La Gleize, perfect compliance with rules for POW treatment seemed less important than justice. The Germans complained. The complaints were noted and ignored. The Belgian civilian evacuation from La Gleize began on December 24th and continued through December 26th. Approximately 130 people needed transportation to safer areas where they could shelter with relatives or in refugee centers. American trucks carried them, families clutching whatever possessions they'd salvaged. Some evacuees looked back at the village as they left, trying to memorize what home had looked like. Others refused to look, staring straight ahead, determined not to let La Gleize's ruins be their last memory of the place. The evacuation was orderly and humane, but it marked the effective end of La Gleize as a functioning community. Most evacuees wouldn't return for months. Some would never return, choosing to rebuild lives elsewhere rather than face the psychological weight of returning to where they'd suffered. The village survived the battle physically. It was still on maps, but as a living community, La Gleize died on December 24, 1944. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in La Gleize passed with strange quietness after 6 days of constant battle noise. American soldiers occupied former German positions, sleeping in cellars that still smelled of German tobacco and sweat. Some men attended Christmas services held by military chaplains in the damaged church. Others simply rested, the kind of profound rest that comes after surviving something that should have killed you. A few soldiers wrote letters home, carefully worded letters that said, "I'm fine," and didn't mention the horror they'd witnessed. One paratrooper, a 19-year-old from Iowa, wrote to his mother, "We won. The Germans are gone. I'm alive. That's all that matters. Merry Christmas." He'd mailed that letter in January, after crossing out the part about being alive, because 2 of his friends had died since Christmas, and saying he was alive when others weren't felt like tempting fate. The historical significance of La Gleize wouldn't become clear until years later when historians analyzed the entire Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, it seemed like one more battle, one more village destroyed, one more set of casualties in a war that had already killed millions. But La Gleize represented something important, the moment when Germany's last offensive capability was broken. Peiper had driven farther than any other German commander. He'd proven German armor was still formidable, German troops still capable of audacious operations, and he'd been trapped, starved out, and defeated by American forces that learned and adapted. The bridge demolitions that stopped Peiper's advance, the encirclement that trapped him, the artillery bombardment that destroyed his combat power, the coordinated assault that forced his retreat. These were the tools that would defeat Germany, not heroic charges or individual bravery, but systematic application of material superiority and tactical competence. La Gleize was a preview of 1945, when those same tools would be applied all across Germany until nothing remained but surrender. 1951, 7 years after the battle, the Municipal Council of La Gleize gathered in their temporary headquarters, a reconstructed farmhouse, since the original village hall was still ruins, to debate an unusual question. German veterans had requested to visit the battlefield where they'd fought. Specifically, they wanted to see the King Tiger tank that still sat at the edge of the village, right where it had broken down during Peiper's retreat. Too heavy to move, too dangerous to demolish when unexploded ordnance was still being cleared, the tank had simply remained there. Now it was becoming a landmark. Tourists were starting to appear, taking photographs. The question before the council was whether to remove the tank or preserve it. Arguments were heated. Some villagers wanted it gone, a monument to German invasion, a reminder of occupation and suffering. Others argued for preservation. This tank told a story, documented history, attracted visitors who might bring economic benefits. The council voted. The tank would stay. It would become a memorial, whether people liked it or not. The preservation of King Tiger No. 213 at La Gleize was accidental, but proved permanent. The tank, weighing 70 tons, had thrown a track during Peiper's withdrawal and been abandoned. German engineers had disabled the gun and destroyed the engine, but the hulk remained intact. Post-war, Belgian authorities considered various options: tow it away for scrap, blow it up in place, bury it. Each option presented problems. Moving it required specialized equipment Belgium didn't have. Destroying it might damage nearby buildings still being reconstructed. Burying it seemed wasteful. So, the tank stayed, and weather began the slow process of transformation. Rain rusted the steel. Moss grew on the flat surfaces. Children played on it, probably unaware of what it represented. By 1951, it had become part of the landscape, and the decision to formally preserve it was really just acknowledging reality. The veterans' reunions that began in the 1950s brought former enemies back to La Gleize, in circumstances nobody could have predicted during the battle. American paratroopers who'd fought to take the village, German soldiers who'd defended it, Belgian civilians who had survived it. They walked the battlefield together, pointing out where defensive positions had been, where tanks had fought, where friends had died. The conversations were awkward initially. How do you make small talk with someone who was trying to kill you 7 years ago? But shared experience created bonds that transcended nationality. They'd all been young men, thrown into a nightmare not of their making, and they'd survived. That commonality mattered more than which uniform they'd worn. Some friendships formed, letters exchanged, Christmas cards sent across borders. Others maintained careful distance, civil but never friendly. The presence of Belgian civilians complicated these reunions. Germans seeking absolution for destruction they'd caused, Belgians who couldn't or wouldn't forgive. The reconstruction of La Gleize proceeded slowly through the 1950s and 60s, constrained by limited funding and the sheer scale of destruction. Some families rebuilt on original foundations, trying to recreate what had existed. Others built modern structures, practical rather than historically accurate. The church was restored, though the stained glass windows, destroyed in the battle, were replaced with plain glass because artisan-quality stained glass was beyond the village's budget. The reconstruction created a strange hybrid, some medieval stone buildings restored, some modern concrete structures inserted, all mixed together in a village that looked simultaneously old and new. Visitors who'd seen pre-war photographs commented that it wasn't the same. Residents agreed, it wasn't the same and never would be. You can rebuild structures, you can't rebuild memory. The 1960s brought the first serious historical documentation, as aging veterans began to share stories they'd kept silent for 20 years. Oral history projects recorded hundreds of hours of testimony, American, German, Belgian. The stories were remarkably consistent in some ways, contradictory in others. Everyone remembered the cold. Everyone remembered the constant artillery. Everyone remembered being hungry and exhausted and terrified. But the larger narratives diverged. German veterans emphasized the tactical brilliance of the initial advance and the tragedy of being abandoned by higher command. American veterans emphasized the courage required to stop the German spearhead against superior equipment. Belgian civilians emphasized the suffering and destruction inflicted by both sides. Each group remembered the battle that mattered to them, not necessarily the battle historians would later reconstruct from documents and evidence. The Malmedy massacre's long shadow over La Gleize reunions became unavoidable as war crimes trials were revisited in the press during the 1960s and 70s. Some German veterans who attended reunions had been defendants in the Malmedy trial. Some had been acquitted. Some had served prison time. American veterans knew this. The unspoken tension was palpable. Can you shake hands with a man who was part of a unit that massacred prisoners? Different people answered differently. Some Americans refused to attend any reunion that included former SS troops. Others took a more nuanced view. Individual guilt versus collective guilt. Whether a 19-year-old panzergunner bore responsibility for what happened in a field he wasn't at. These questions had no good answers, only compromises that allowed people to move forward while acknowledging the past couldn't be erased. Joachim Peiper's post-war life and death became intertwined with La Gleize's memory in ways that complicated historical interpretation. After his release from prison in 1956, Peiper worked in the German automotive industry and tried to fade into private life. He refused most interview requests. He didn't attend veterans' reunions. He gave no public speeches. He tried to disappear. But the past followed him. In 1976, living in a small French town under an assumed name, his identity was exposed by communist activists. On July 14th, Bastille Day, his house was firebombed. Peiper died in the fire. The perpetrators were never caught. French authorities investigated half-heartedly, unwilling to expend significant resources solving the murder of a convicted war criminal. Some saw Peiper's death as justice finally served. Others saw it as vigilante murder. His death ensured that La Gleize discussions would always include the question, was he a brilliant tactician or a war criminal? The answer, uncomfortable for those who prefer moral clarity, was both. The December Museum, formally opened in La Gleize in 1981, represented the village's attempt to control its own historical narrative. Located near the preserved King Tiger, the museum displayed artifacts recovered from the battlefield, uniforms from all sides, photographs, and personal testimonies. The curation was remarkably balanced. German equipment displayed alongside American, Belgian civilian suffering, documented alongside military operations. The museum avoided simplistic good versus evil narratives, instead presenting the battle's complexity. This approach pleased historians and upset some veterans from all sides who wanted their group's heroism emphasized more. But the museum's directors held firm. La Gleize belonged to everyone who had suffered there, and everyone's story deserved telling. It became one of the premier Battle of the Bulge museums, drawing 40,000 visitors annually by the 1990s. The 2000th anniversary ceremonies in 2004 brought together the last surviving participants, now in their 80s, a handful of American veterans, a few German survivors, several Belgian civilians who'd been children during the battle. The number of living witnesses was diminishing rapidly. By 2004, most participants had died. The survivors who gathered at La Gleize walked the battlefield with canes and wheelchairs, pointing out locations to grandchildren who tried to imagine the horror being described. One American veteran, a former paratrooper named James Chen, stood beside the King Tiger and told his grandson, "I was supposed to kill the crew of that tank. They were supposed to kill me. We both survived, and now here we are looking at it like it's ancient history. But it's not ancient. It's yesterday. It never stops being yesterday." Chen died 6 months later. His grandson inherited his medals and his nightmares. The latter transmitted through years of watching an old man wake up screaming from dreams about Belgium. The battlefield preservation efforts expanded in the 2000s as historians recognized La Gleize's importance. Walking trails were established following German defensive positions and American assault routes. Information plaques marked significant locations. The chateau, partially restored, became a memorial site. But preservation raised uncomfortable questions. Should the village preserve the ruins, maintaining evidence of destruction, or complete reconstruction and restore normalcy? Different structures made different choices. Some ruins were left as memorial spaces. Others were rebuilt. The result was a landscape of mixed memory, where visitors might see a restored farmhouse next to a preserved shell crater, a functioning church beside a memorial wall listing civilian casualties. The battlefield became a palimpsest, layers of history visible simultaneously. The modern tourism industry that developed around La Gleize brought economic benefits and ethical complications. Hotels and restaurants catered to battlefield tourists. Gift shops sold books and memorabilia. Bus tours stopped at the King Tiger for photo opportunities. The village's economy, devastated by the battle, was partially rebuilt on the battle's memory. But commodifying trauma felt uncomfortable to some. Elderly Belgian residents watched tourists take selfies in front of the tank and felt a disconnect. These were graves to them, Instagram backdrops to visitors. The village council tried to balance economic necessity with memorial dignity, establishing guidelines for appropriate tourist behavior. Signs requested respectful conduct. Most visitors complied, some didn't. The tension between memorial site and tourist attraction never fully resolved. The casualties, refined by decades of historical research, told the story in numbers that became more precise but not less tragic. 27 Belgian civilians killed, 780 American military casualties, 4,000 German casualties including killed, wounded, and captured. These weren't estimates anymore, but documented facts, each number representing a name, a family, a life interrupted or ended. Historians published books detailing the battle hour by hour, reconstructing movements and decisions with scholarly precision. But precision doesn't capture truth. The numbers don't convey what it felt like to shelter in a cellar for 6 days, or to watch your tank burn with your friends inside, or to order an assault knowing some men won't return. The gap between documented history and lived experience remains unbridgeable. The final surviving veteran of the Battle of La Gleize died in 2019, a Belgian civilian named Marie Solheide, who had been 8 years old during the battle. She'd spent her entire life in the village, refusing to leave despite the memories. In her final interview, conducted 2 months before her death at age 83, she said, "People ask if I've forgiven the Germans. That's the wrong question. The soldiers who came to La Gleize, they were victims too. Boys from Bavaria and Saxony, dying for a madman's dream. The crime was the war itself, not the individuals caught in it, except the ones who murdered. Them I don't forgive." She died peacefully, surrounded by grandchildren who'd heard her stories so many times they could recite them verbatim. Her funeral was attended by the mayor, the museum director, and 2 elderly German veterans who'd traveled from Germany to pay respects to a woman who'd survived what they'd inflicted. The King Tiger at La Gleize sits there still, more than 80 years after the battle. Rust has consumed much of the steel. The gun droops slightly, metal fatigue weakening the barrel. Children climb on it during school visits, probably unaware of what it represents. Tourists photograph it, an impressive relic from an era of industrial warfare that seems almost quaint compared to modern weapons. But for those who know the history, who understand what that tank represents, it remains powerful. Not as a monument to German engineering or Allied victory, but as a memorial to a moment when ordinary people, soldiers, civilians, people who wanted nothing more than to survive, were consumed by history's machinery, and somehow, against probability, some of them lived to remember. The tank is memory in steel, slowly returning to the earth while the stories attached to it pass from living memory to historical record. In another 80 years, everyone who fought at La Gleize will be dead. Everyone who knew someone who fought there will be dead. The tank will remain until it too finally rusts away, leaving only the stories and the question, what was it all for? The question has no good answer. It never did.